Think about what you ate for breakfast this morning. Maybe it was toast made from wheat, maybe cereal from oats or corn, perhaps eggs from chickens you keep penned up, or milk from cows that never roam more than a few acres. Maybe you had coffee grown on a plantation thousands of miles away, sweetened with processed sugar from cane fields. Now here's what's strange. Every single thing you just ate exists because of a decision our ancestors made 9,000 years ago. A decision that, by every rational measure, should have killed them all. A decision that made them shorter, sicker, hungrier, and more miserable than they'd been for the previous 290,000 years of human existence. A decision that created famine, disease, warfare, and environmental collapse. They abandoned a survival strategy that had worked perfectly since before our species even existed. They traded health for sickness, abundance for scarcity, freedom for backbreaking labour. And they did it so completely, so irreversibly, that within a few thousand years there was no going back. The trap had closed. We call it the agricultural revolution. But revolution makes it sound deliberate, planned, triumphant. It wasn't. It was humanity stumbling into the most dangerous gamble in our history. And about 8,200 years ago, that gamble nearly failed completely. Climate catastrophe, crop failures, mass starvation, the collapse of every early farming society across an entire region. Civilization should have ended before it really began. But somehow, impossibly, it didn't. And if you're using this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these videos. Hit subscribe if you haven't already, and tell me in the comments where you are right now and what you had for breakfast today. I love seeing Tokyo at sunrise, London at lunch, Manila at midnight, all of us connected by a 9,000-year-old decision that somehow, against all odds, worked out. Over the next few hours, we're going to explore the most dangerous transition in human history. We'll see what we lost, what we gained, and how terrifyingly close we came to losing everything. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's go back to the last good days before agriculture, before civilization, before humanity made the worst survival decision imaginable and somehow lived to tell about it. 50,000 years ago, your ancestors were living the best lives humans had ever known. I know that sounds wrong. Everything you've been taught suggests that life before civilization was nasty, brutish, and short. That our prehistoric ancestors were struggling to survive, constantly hungry, dying young, living in fear and ignorance. But the archaeological evidence tells a completely different story, and it's one of the most important stories you've never heard, because it reveals what we actually gave up when we invented agriculture. What we traded away for the world we have now. Picture this. You're living in what's now southern France, about 40,000 years ago. It's late summer, and you're part of a band of maybe 30 people, extended family mostly, people you've known your entire life. This morning, you woke up when you felt like it. No alarm, no schedule, no boss expecting you at a particular time. The sun was already well up, filtering through the hide covering the entrance to your shelter. You spent maybe 2 hours this morning doing what we'd call work. You walked down to the river with a few others and checked the fish traps you'd set yesterday, pulled out enough salmon for today and tomorrow. One of your cousins spotted a stand of hazelnut trees about half a mile upstream, so you gathered a few pounds of those. Easy work, enjoyable even. You were back at camp by midday. The rest of the day, you spent it doing whatever you wanted. Maybe you worked on that carved bone pendant you've been making. Maybe you played with the kids, teaching them to throw a spear. Maybe you just sat and talked, sharing stories, gossiping, laughing. Maybe you napped in the afternoon sunshine. This wasn't a particularly good day. This was just a normal day. And this is what the evidence shows was normal for anatomically modern humans for hundreds of thousands of years. The archaeological record is remarkably clear on this. When anthropologists examine skeletal remains from hunter-gatherer populations, they see people who were as tall as modern Europeans didn't reach again until the 20th century. They see bones that are robust and well-formed, indicating good nutrition throughout childhood. They see teeth that are remarkably healthy, with almost no cavities. They see evidence of people regularly living into their 60s and 70s, assuming they survived childhood diseases and accidents. Modern studies of the few remaining hunter-gatherer societies confirm what the ancient bones suggest. In the 1960s, an anthropologist named Richard Lee spent years living with the San people of the Kalahari Desert in southern Africa. He meticulously tracked how they spent their time, and what he found shocked the academic world. The San worked, on average, about 12 to 19 hours per week to meet all their subsistence needs. That's total. Hunting, gathering, preparing food, maintaining tools and shelters, everything. The rest of their time, and they had a lot of it, was leisure. They visited other bands, they held elaborate ceremonies, they created art, they played games, they told stories. They lived, by almost any measure, lives that were more relaxed, less stressful, and more socially fulfilling than most modern humans experience. And they did this in the Kalahari Desert, one of the harshest environments on Earth. They'd been pushed there by agricultural populations expanding across southern Africa. This was their refuge, the place nobody else wanted, and even there they thrived. Now imagine what life was like for hunter-gatherers living in actually rich environments, river valleys teeming with fish, forests full of game and edible plants, coastlines where shellfish could be harvested year-round. These weren't desperate people scraping by. These were people living in what anthropologists now call the original affluent society. The key to their success was diversity. A typical hunter-gatherer band would exploit somewhere between 150 and 200 different food sources throughout the year. In spring, they'd focus on certain plants and migrating birds. In summer, different plants, fish-spawning runs, turtle eggs. In fall, nuts and berries and fattening game. In winter, stored nuts, hunting, and coastal resources if they were near the sea. This diversity was their insurance policy. If one food source failed, they had dozens of others to fall back on. Drought affected some plants but not others. Disease might wipe out one animal population but leave the rest untouched. There was virtually no scenario where all their food sources disappeared simultaneously. Compare this to what would come later, agricultural societies depending on 3 or 4 crops. Maybe wheat, barley and lentils if you were in the Fertile Crescent. Corn, beans and squash if you were in Mesoamerica. Rice and millet in China. Lose any one of those crops to drought or disease or pests, and you face starvation. Lose 2, and everyone died. Hunter-gatherers also had another massive advantage: mobility. If conditions got bad in one area, they just moved. Drought dried up your regular water sources. Walk to the next valley. Game populations declining. Shift to a different territory. Forest fire destroyed your favourite foraging grounds. They'll recover in a few years. Meanwhile, you've got dozens of other places you can go. This mobility meant they could avoid problems that would later devastate agricultural societies. Disease outbreak in your band? Split up temporarily, spread out across the landscape? Conflict with neighbouring groups? Move away! You didn't have to stand and fight over territory, because you didn't have permanent territories you absolutely required. The entire landscape was your resource base. The skeletal evidence shows just how healthy this lifestyle was. When bioarchaeologists compare the bones of late hunter-gatherers to early farmers from the same regions, the differences are stark and consistent across every population studied. Hunter-gatherers were taller. Men averaged about 5 feet 9 inches, women about 5 feet 5. Those are heights that European and American populations didn't reach again until the 1900s, 10,000 years later. Early farmers were on average 4 to 6 inches shorter. That's a huge difference. And it tells us something important. Height is an incredibly sensitive indicator of childhood nutrition. If you don't get enough calories and nutrients during your growing years, you don't reach your genetic potential for height. The hunter-gatherers were reaching theirs, the farmers weren't. Hunter-gatherer teeth were remarkably healthy. Cavities were rare, maybe 5% of teeth showing any decay. Their teeth were worn down from a lifetime of chewing, but they were fundamentally healthy. Early farmer teeth? Cavity rates jump to 20, 30, sometimes 50%. Some populations show evidence of abscesses and tooth loss that would have been agonizing. The culprit was grain. Grain is full of fermentable carbohydrates that oral bacteria love. Hunter-gatherers eating mostly meat, fish, nuts, vegetables and fruits weren't giving those bacteria much to work with. The bones themselves tell stories about disease and stress. Hunter-gatherer skeletons show very low rates of what's called porotic hyperostosis, a bone lesion that indicates chronic anemia and nutritional stress. Early farmer skeletons. The rates jump dramatically. Same with enamel hypoplasia, defects in tooth enamel that form during childhood when you're not getting adequate nutrition. Hunter-gatherers show these rarely. Farmers show them commonly. Even more telling, hunter-gatherer skeletons show very little evidence of infectious disease. The bones don't show the lesions that tuberculosis leaves, or the damage from chronic infections, or the markers of epidemic diseases. Farming populations show all of these. Tuberculosis, leprosy, and a host of other infectious diseases that would later kill hundreds of millions of people appear in the skeletal record right around the time agriculture appears. So why were hunter-gatherers so much healthier? Part of it was diet. They were eating a huge variety of foods, getting micronutrients from dozens of sources. Meat and fish provided complete proteins and essential fats. Nuts provided calories and minerals. Fruits and vegetables provided vitamins. They weren't dependent on any single food, so they didn't suffer from the nutritional deficiencies that come from grain-heavy diets. But part of it was also population density. Hunter-gatherer bands were small and spread out, maybe 30 people living together, with neighbouring bands dozens of miles away. This meant diseases couldn't spread easily. There simply weren't enough people in close contact for epidemics to take hold, and because they moved frequently, they weren't living in their own waste, they didn't have sanitation problems, they didn't have sewage contaminating their water supplies. The lifestyle also meant they didn't suffer from many of the chronic health problems that plague agricultural societies. They weren't doing repetitive back-breaking labour day after day. They weren't hunched over grinding grain for hours. They weren't carrying heavy loads long distances regularly. So they didn't develop the arthritis, the spine problems, the joint damage that show up constantly in farmer skeletons. And here's something remarkable. Hunter-gatherers had leisure time to stay active in ways that weren't pure labour. They climbed, they ran, they swam, they played games that kept them fit. The result was populations that were not just tall and well-fed, but genuinely athletic, strong, flexible, with excellent cardiovascular health. Their social lives were richer too. Anthropological studies of modern hunter-gatherers consistently show tight-knit communities with strong social bonds. Everyone knows everyone. Children are raised communally, with multiple adults caring for them. Conflicts are resolved through discussion, and if necessary by one party simply leaving. There's very little violence within bands because there's no property to fight over, no wealth to accumulate, no hierarchy to enforce. Archaeological evidence supports this picture of prehistoric egalitarianism. Hunter-gatherer burials show very little differentiation. No kings buried with massive wealth, while others get nothing. No slave burials versus master burials. People are buried with similar grave goods suggesting similar status. The few items buried with them are personal possessions, tools, ornaments. Nothing suggests significant inequality in life. This equality extended to gender relations. Ethnographic studies of hunter-gatherers show that while men and women often had different roles, these roles were complementary rather than hierarchical. Women's gathering often provided more calories than men's hunting. Both were essential, both were valued. There's no evidence of the systematic subordination of women that would later characterize many agricultural societies. The archaeological sites from this period paint a picture of populations that were successful, stable, and sustainable for staggering lengths of time. Some hunter-gatherer camps show evidence of seasonal occupation for thousands of years. People would return to the same favourable locations generation after generation, century after century, using the same resource extraction strategies because those strategies worked. This wasn't primitive, it was sophisticated. These people had encyclopedic knowledge of their environments. They knew hundreds of plant species which were edible, which were poisonous, which had medicinal properties, when each one fruited or had edible roots. They knew animal behaviour patterns, migration routes, denning sites, feeding preferences. They knew how to read weather, how to predict seasonal changes, how to find water in dry periods. They had technology that was elegant and effective. Stone tools shaped with precision, bone needles fine enough to sew tailored clothing, spear throwers that could launch projectiles with deadly force and accuracy, fishing equipment sophisticated enough to harvest riverine and marine resources sustainably. And they had art. Beautiful, moving, technically accomplished art. The cave paintings at Lascaux and Chauvet show animals rendered with an accuracy and grace that rivals any modern wildlife art. Carved figurines show abstract representation and symbolic thinking. Musical instruments, flutes carved from bone, suggest they had leisure time for creative expression and the cognitive sophistication to appreciate complex auditory art. This was the human condition for the vast majority of our existence as a species, for 290,000 years after anatomically modern humans appeared, for millions of years before that, stretching back through our hominin ancestors. This worked. It worked spectacularly well. Population levels were sustainable. People weren't having as many children as biologically possible because they didn't need to. A nomadic lifestyle means you can't carry more than one infant at a time, so births were naturally spaced 3 to 4 years apart. This kept population density low, which kept resources abundant, which kept everyone healthy. It was, by almost any objective measure, a better way to live than what was coming. Less work, better health, more equality, greater personal freedom, richer social lives. The only real downside was infant mortality, which was genuinely high. Maybe 30 to 40% of children didn't make it to adulthood, mostly from accidents and childhood diseases. But for those who did survive childhood, life expectancy was actually quite good. Many people lived into their 60s and 70s, dying of old age rather than starvation or disease. So here's the question that should keep you up at night, except we're trying to help you sleep, so maybe ponder it gently as you drift off. If this lifestyle was so successful, so sustainable, so much healthier and more pleasant than what came after, why did anyone ever abandon it? Why would you give up 15-hour work weeks for dawn to dusk labour in fields? Why would you give up robust health for chronic malnutrition? Why would you give up freedom and equality for hierarchy and coercion? The simple answer is they didn't choose to. Not really. They stumbled into a trap, and by the time they realised what was happening, it was too late to escape. That trap was set by climate change, by population pressure, and by the insidious nature of agriculture itself. Once you start farming, even just a little bit, you trigger feedback loops that force you to farm more and more until you're completely dependent on it. And that's where our story really begins, not with a choice, but with a trap slowly closing around people who couldn't see it happening until their children were too numerous to feed any other way, until their knowledge of wild foods had faded, until the wild game had retreated from their now permanent settlements. By then they were farmers, and farmers they would remain, even when it nearly killed them all. 12,000 years ago, something changed. Not everywhere, not all at once, but in one particular region of the world, in a crescent-shaped area stretching from the Persian Gulf through modern-day Iraq and Syria, and down through the Levant to Egypt, something began to shift in how humans lived, and, once it started, it couldn't be stopped. This region, which archaeologists would later call the Fertile Crescent, had everything a hunter-gatherer could want. 2 massive river systems, the Tigris and Euphrates, providing reliable water and rich floodplain ecosystems. Mountains to the north with cooler forests full of game. Mediterranean coastline to the west with marine resources. A climate that was, at the time, much wetter and more temperate than it is today. And crucially, the Fertile Crescent was home to the wild ancestors of several plants that would change human history. Wild wheat, growing in dense stands across hillsides. Wild barley in the valley bottoms. Wild lentils, peas and chickpeas. The seeds of these plants were edible, nutritious and abundant. Hunter-gatherers had been harvesting them seasonally for thousands of years. But around 12,500 years ago, some groups started doing something slightly different. They began staying near these wild grain fields for longer periods. They built more permanent structures, not just seasonal camps, but houses that would last years. They invested more time in harvesting and processing grain because it was there. It was abundant, and why not? These people are called the Natufians, and they're the key to understanding how the trap closed. Because the Natufians didn't invent agriculture. They weren't farmers yet. They were still primarily hunter-gatherers. But they were sedentary hunter-gatherers, people who'd stopped moving. And that decision, the choice to stay in one place, set off a chain reaction that would be impossible to reverse. Here's what happened. When you're nomadic, you can only have as many children as you can carry. Infants are helpless for the first year or 2 of life, and no mother can carry more than 1 infant while also travelling, gathering and doing everything else necessary for survival. So births naturally space themselves 3 to 4 years apart. This keeps population growth very slow. But when you settle down, that constraint disappears. You're not moving anymore. You can have a baby, and then another one 2 years later, and another 2 years after that. Each child can stay at the settlement while you go out to gather. Older children can watch younger ones. Suddenly families grow larger. The Natufians didn't plan this. It just happened. Sedentary life meant more surviving children. which meant population growth. And population growth meant you needed more food to support more people. So you harvested more wild grain. You invested more time in processing it. You built more storage facilities for it. You became more dependent on it. And the more you harvested, the more you inadvertently started selecting for certain characteristics in the grain itself. This is where domestication begins, not as a deliberate invention but as an accident of repeated harvesting. Wild wheat and barley have a clever evolutionary strategy. When the seeds ripen, the seed head shatters. The seeds scatter across the ground, spreading the next generation widely. This is great for the plant. It's terrible for a human trying to harvest it. You walk up to a stand of wild wheat, and as soon as you touch the stalks, half the seeds fall to the ground and are lost. But every so often there's a mutant plant, a genetic mistake where the seed head doesn't shatter properly. The seeds stay attached to the stalk even when ripe. In nature, this is a disadvantage. Those seeds don't spread as well. But for a human harvester, this mutant is perfect. You can cut the stalk, carry it back to camp, and process all the seeds without losing any. So here's what happened. Every year, the Natufians would go out and harvest wild grain. They'd preferentially collect from plants with less shattering seed heads, because those were easier to harvest. They'd bring those seeds back to their settlement, eat most of them, but inevitably drop some around the village. Those dropped seeds would sprout the next year right near the settlement. And those plants, selected for non-shattering seed heads, would be the ones growing closest to home, the ones most convenient to harvest next year. Generation after generation, without realizing it, they were selecting for domesticated grain. Grain that couldn't survive on its own anymore, that needed humans to plant it, but grain that was much easier for humans to harvest and use. The same thing happened with other plants. Wild lentils have seeds that stay dormant for varying lengths of time, another evolutionary strategy to spread out germination in case of bad years. But dormant seeds are useless to humans, so they inadvertently selected for lentils that germinated reliably and quickly. Wild peas had tough pods that protected seeds from being eaten. They selected for tender pods that were easier to process. Wild chickpeas were toxic when raw. Over time they selected for less toxic varieties. None of this was deliberate. It was just the inevitable result of repeated harvesting, processing, and dropping seeds around permanent settlements. But the result was that within a few thousand years, they'd created domesticated plants. Plants that were easier to use, but plants that also required human intervention to survive. And here's where the trap really starts to close. Because remember, the Natufian population was growing. More mouths to feed meant they needed more food. Wild game was declining because permanent settlements scare away animals. Wild plant resources near the settlement were being over-harvested, so they relied more and more on grain. And at some point, someone figured out that if you deliberately planted seeds in prepared ground, you got better yields than just harvesting wild stands. This wasn't a revolutionary insight, it was an obvious incremental step, but it was the step that transformed grain from a supplemental food to a staple crop. Now they were farmers. Not entirely, not yet. They still hunted, still gathered wild plants, still got maybe half their calories from traditional hunter-gatherer activities. But they were farming. They were planting fields of wheat and barley. They were dependent on those fields producing. They couldn't leave anymore, not during planting season, not during the growing season, not during harvest. They were tied to the land. And the population kept growing. Because farming could support higher population densities than hunting and gathering, you could get more calories per acre from a wheat field than from foraging for wild seeds. So more children survived, which meant you needed to farm more intensively, which meant less time for hunting and gathering, which meant more dependence on crops. The feedback loop was vicious and self-reinforcing. More people meant more farming. More farming meant less hunting and gathering. Less hunting and gathering meant more dependence on crops. More dependence meant less mobility. Less mobility meant more children. More children meant more people, around and around. And it was happening slowly enough that no single generation realized what was being lost. Each generation farmed a little more than the last, hunted a little less, moved a little less frequently. The knowledge of wild plants faded gradually. The skills of tracking game eroded incrementally. By the time anyone might have thought to go back to full-time hunting and gathering, they couldn't. There were too many people. They needed the crop yields. The evidence for this transition is written in the bones. Archaeologists have excavated Natufian sites, and the sites of the people who came after them, the earliest true farmers, and the skeletal evidence is stark. Natufian skeletons show people who are still relatively tall and healthy. Men averaged about 5 feet 7 inches, not quite as tall as pure hunter-gatherers, but still respectable. Their bones show some stress, some evidence of dietary deficiency, but nothing catastrophic. They were in transition, supplementing traditional diets with more grain, and it was beginning to show, but they were managing. Then look at the skeletons from just a few generations later, from people who were fully committed to farming, who were getting 70 to 80% of their calories from cultivated grain. Men averaging 5 feet 3 inches, women barely 5 feet. That's a loss of 4 to 6 inches in just a few generations. That doesn't happen because of genetics. That happens because of malnutrition during childhood. Their bones tell other stories too. Evidence of porotic hyperostosis, those lesions that indicate chronic anemia, jump dramatically. They're not getting enough iron, not enough B vitamins, because they're eating mostly grain instead of the diverse diet their ancestors had. Enamel hyperplasia, those defects in tooth enamel from childhood nutritional stress, become commonplace. Every farmer child is growing up malnourished, and the teeth. This is where the evidence is most dramatic. Natufian teeth show some increase in cavities compared to pure hunter-gatherers. Maybe 10 to 15% of teeth affected. Early farmer teeth? 30, 40, sometimes 50% showing cavities. Abscesses, tooth loss, infections that would have been agonizing and sometimes fatal. The culprit was the grain itself. They were eating it multiple times a day now, making it into porridge, into flatbreads, all those carbohydrates sitting on their teeth feeding the bacteria that cause decay. Their mouths were rotting. Every farmer was dealing with dental pain that hunter-gatherers rarely experienced. The skeletons also show new patterns of wear and injury. Arthritis in the knees from crouching to plant and weed and harvest. Spinal damage from carrying heavy loads. Repetitive strain injuries in wrists and hands from grinding grain for hours every day. Hunter-gatherers moved through landscapes, using their bodies in varied ways. Farmers did the same repetitive motions day after day, year after year, and their bodies paid the price. And they knew. They must have known it was worse. The oldest members of early farming communities had been born when their parents and grandparents still spent significant time hunting and gathering. They could remember, or their parents could tell them, about the old ways, about eating deer and wild boar instead of grain porridge, about having time to rest instead of endless field labour, about teeth that didn't hurt, but they couldn't go back. There were too many of them now. A region that might have supported 500 people as hunter-gatherers now had 2,000 people dependent on farming. The game populations had already been hunted down. The wild plant stands had been replaced by cultivated fields. The knowledge of how to live as mobile hunter-gatherers was fading. They were trapped. And then, around 10,800 years ago, the climate made everything worse. The world had been warming steadily since the end of the last ice age. But suddenly, catastrophically, that warming stopped. Temperatures plunged back toward ice age levels in an event called the Younger Dryas. It lasted for more than 1,000 years. For hunter-gatherers, this would have been manageable. They would have followed the retreating forests, adjusted their seasonal patterns, relied on different food sources. But for the early farmers, it was a crisis. Crops failed, growing seasons shortened. The wild wheat and barley stands, already stressed by climate change, retreated to smaller refuges in the mountains. This should have been the moment when agriculture collapsed. When people realized this new way of life was too vulnerable, too risky, and went back to the old ways. But by then they couldn't. The population was too large. The skills were too degraded. Instead, they did the only thing they could do. They doubled down on agriculture. They started deliberately planting seeds in larger fields. They developed irrigation to combat drought. They invested more labor, worked harder, tried to coax enough food from the land to keep everyone alive. And somehow, barely, they managed it. Not everywhere. Some settlements were abandoned, some populations crashed. But enough survived, and when the Younger Dryas finally ended around 9,600 years ago, agriculture emerged stronger, not weaker. Because that's the insidious nature of agriculture. It's not that farming was better than hunting and gathering, it wasn't. Every measure we have shows early farmers were less healthy, worked harder, and lived shorter lives. But farming could support more people per square mile. And once you had those people, once the population grew beyond what hunting and gathering could sustain, you were committed. You had to farm. You had no choice. This is what scholars call the agricultural trap, or sometimes the Neolithic trap. Once you start farming, even just as a supplement to hunting and gathering, you trigger population growth. That growth forces you to farm more intensively. More intensive farming means less time and space for hunting and gathering, which means more dependence on crops, which supports more population growth. The trap closes gradually, generation by generation, until going back is impossible, and it was closing all across the Fertile Crescent during these centuries, in Syria, in the Levant, in Anatolia, in the foothills of the Zagros Mountains. Different groups, independent of each other, all stumbling into the same trap, domesticating wheat and barley, later domesticating sheep and goats, building permanent villages, watching their populations grow and their health decline, and somehow knowing that they'd made a terrible mistake but being unable to do anything about it. There's a site in Syria called Abu Huraira that captures this transition perfectly. It was occupied continuously from 11,500 years ago through 7,000 years ago. The early layers show a hunter-gatherer settlement. Diverse diet, healthy skeletons, mobile population. The middle layers show the transition. More reliance on wild grain, first permanent structures, growing population. The late layers show full agriculture. Wheat and barley fields, sheep and goat herds, large permanent village, and skeletons showing all the health problems that came with farming. You can see the trap closing in those layers. You can see people making small, reasonable decisions that seem to improve their lives in the moment. Harvesting more grain because it's available. Staying in one place because why not? Having more children because now you can. Each decision made sense individually. But together, they lock their descendants into a way of life that was measurably worse than what came before. And perhaps the most remarkable thing, even at the end, even when they were fully committed, farmers suffering from malnutrition and dental disease and backbreaking labour, they were building monuments. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey was constructed starting around 9,600 years ago. Massive stone pillars, elaborately carved, arranged in circular structures. It took thousands of work hours to build, hundreds of people cooperating on a project that had no practical purpose whatsoever. Scholars debate what Göbekli Tepe represents. Some think it was built by the last complex hunter-gatherers, a final flourishing before agriculture fully took over. Others think it was built by early farmers, perhaps as a way to organize and motivate labor, to create shared identity in these new larger communities. Either way, it shows something crucial. These people weren't stupid. They weren't ignorant. They were capable of sophisticated planning, complex symbolism, massive cooperative projects. They could see what was happening to them. They watched their children grow shorter than they had been. They felt the pain in their teeth, their joints, their backs. They remembered or heard stories about the old ways. But they couldn't go back. The trap had closed. And so they did what humans do when trapped. They adapted. They innovated. They found ways to make it work. Not because farming was better, but because they had no choice. By 9,000 years ago, agriculture was established and spreading. From the Fertile Crescent, it would eventually reach Europe, Central Asia, North Africa. Similar transitions were beginning independently in China, with rice and millet, in Mesoamerica with corn and beans, in sub-Saharan Africa with sorghum and yams, in South America with potatoes and quinoa. All over the world, humans were stumbling into the same trap, and all of them were making themselves more vulnerable. Because they'd traded diversity for monoculture, mobility for permanent settlement, resilience for productivity. They'd created a way of life that could support more people, but that was also fragile in ways hunting and gathering never was. Fragile to drought, fragile to disease, fragile to climate change. And about 8,200 years ago, that fragility would nearly destroy everything they'd built. So now you're a farmer, let's say it's 8,500 years ago, and you're living in a small village somewhere in what's now southern Turkey. Your great-great-grandparents might have still remembered hunting and gathering, but for you, agriculture is just how life works. You plant wheat and barley in the fall, harvest in late spring, and spend much of the summer processing and storing grain. And on the surface, things seem fine. Your village has maybe 200 people, which feels enormous compared to the hunting bands of 30 or 40 your distant ancestors lived in. There are children everywhere, far more than any mobile hunter-gatherer group could have supported. You have a house, a real permanent structure with mud brick walls and a roof. You have storage bins full of grain that will last through the winter. You have flocks of sheep and goats. You feel secure. You have food stored away. You have animals you can slaughter when you need meat. You have a community large enough to defend against threats. This must be better, right? All these people, all this food, all this permanence. But beneath that surface security, you've created vulnerabilities that your hunter-gatherer ancestors never faced. Vulnerabilities that are invisible until they suddenly become catastrophic. Let me show you what you've actually done. First, your diet. Remember how your hunter-gatherer ancestors ate from 150 to 200 different food sources throughout the year? You're getting 70 to 80% of your calories from exactly 3 plants: wheat, barley, and lentils. That's it. Maybe you supplement with some vegetables, some fruit when it's in season, occasionally some meat from your sheep and goats. But the overwhelming majority of what you eat day after day, month after month, year after year is grain. Your breakfast is wheat porridge, your lunch is barley flatbread, your dinner is lentil stew with wheat bread. It's filling, it keeps you alive, but it's nutritionally incomplete in ways your body can feel, even if you don't understand why. You're not getting enough protein. Grain is low in protein compared to the meat and fish your ancestors ate. You're not getting complete proteins with all the essential amino acids. You're constantly slightly protein deficient, which means your muscles don't develop fully, your immune system doesn't function optimally, your body struggles to repair tissue damage, you're not getting enough iron. The iron in plant foods isn't as bioavailable as the iron in meat. Plus, the phytic acid in grains actually blocks iron absorption. So even though you're eating plenty of food, you're becoming anemic. You feel tired all the time, you get sick more easily. If you're a woman, the combination of anemia and repeated pregnancies is slowly killing you. You're not getting enough vitamins. Grain is low in vitamin A, vitamin C, vitamin D. You're developing what we'd call micronutrient deficiencies. Your night vision is getting worse. Your gums bleed. Your bones are weakening. Children in your village are growing up shorter and weaker than their parents, who are already shorter and weaker than their parents. The skeletal evidence from settlements like yours is brutal. Archaeologists can look at the bones and see exactly what this diet did. Porotic hyperostosis, those lesions on the skull that indicate chronic anemia, shows up in 30 to 50% of early farming populations. In hunter-gatherers, it's maybe 5%. That's a 6 to 10-fold increase in a condition that causes fatigue, weakness, increased vulnerability to disease. Enamel hypoplasia, those permanent defects in tooth enamel that form when children don't get adequate nutrition, becomes universal. Almost every child in farming communities shows these defects. In hunter-gatherer populations, they're rare. This isn't a cosmetic issue. It's evidence that every child is growing up malnourished, that their bodies are under constant nutritional stress during critical developmental periods, and the teeth themselves, your mouth is a disaster. You've probably lost several teeth already, even though you're only in your 20s. The teeth you still have hurt constantly. Several have cavities, holes rotted through the enamel by the bacteria that feast on the constant supply of fermentable carbohydrates you're eating. One molar has an abscess, an infection in the root that's swollen and agonizing. You can't chew on that side anymore. There's no dentist who can help you. No antibiotics to clear the infection. You just live with the pain, day after day, hoping it doesn't get bad enough to kill you. And it might. Dental abscesses can spread to the jaw, to the bloodstream, to the brain. People die from infected teeth in your village. It happens. This is one of the most visible costs of agriculture in the archaeological record. Hunter-gatherer teeth show cavity rates of 5 to 10%. Farmer teeth jump to 30 to 50%, sometimes higher. Some skulls show evidence of massive abscesses, bone destruction from chronic untreated infections, tooth loss that would have made eating excruciating. But the nutritional problems and dental problems are just the beginning. Because you're also living with animals now. Domesticated sheep and goats that live right next to your house, sometimes inside it during cold nights. Pigs rooting around the village, eating garbage, dogs everywhere. And those animals are carrying diseases. Your ancestors didn't live with animals like this. They hunted animals, killed them quickly, processed them, and moved on. They weren't in constant close contact with the same animals day after day, but you are. You're breathing the same air as your sheep. You're touching them, milking them, helping with births, handling their waste, and their diseases are jumping to you. This is where tuberculosis comes from. It evolved from a cattle disease. As humans domesticated cattle and lived in close contact with them, the bacterium that caused bovine tuberculosis mutated and became human tuberculosis, and once it had human hosts, it spread. Tuberculosis thrives in exactly the conditions you're living in. Crowded settlements where people live close together, poorly ventilated houses where smoke from cooking fires fills the air and damages lungs, malnourished populations whose immune systems can't fight off infection effectively, people living in permanent settlements who can't just move away from sick individuals. The disease spreads slowly, person to person, through the air. Someone coughs, and tiny droplets carrying bacteria drift to the next person. In a village of 200 people all living within shouting distance of each other, tuberculosis finds plenty of new hosts. It becomes endemic, always present in the population, killing steadily year after year. The skeletons show it. Tuberculosis leaves distinctive lesions on bones, particularly the spine. These lesions are essentially absent in hunter-gatherer skeletons. They start appearing in early farming communities and become increasingly common as agriculture intensifies and populations grow. Leprosy follows a similar pattern. It's another disease that evolved from animal origins, possibly from water buffalo or armadillos, and jumped to humans living in close contact with domesticated animals. It spreads through prolonged close contact, exactly the kind of contact you have in a permanent village where you see the same people every single day for your entire life. And there are other diseases, ones that don't leave marks on bones but the historical records would later document. Measles, smallpox, influenza, all evolved from animal diseases, all emerged during the agricultural transition, all became major killers of human populations. But in your village 8,500 years ago, you don't understand any of this. You just know that people get sick more often than the stories say they used to. Children die with terrifying regularity. Respiratory infections sweep through the village every winter. Fevers come and go. Everyone seems to be sick with something. The population density is the problem. Your village has 200 people living in an area that might have supported 15 or 20 hunter-gatherers. That's 10 times the population density. And with 10 times as many people in close proximity, diseases spread 10 times more easily. When someone in a hunter-gatherer band got sick, the band could split up temporarily. The sick person could be isolated with 1 or 2 caregivers, while the rest of the group moved away, limiting disease spread. And if the disease was fatal, it died with the patient. There weren't enough people in close enough contact for epidemic diseases to establish themselves. But in your village, you can't split up. You're tied to your fields, your stored grain, your permanent houses. When someone gets sick, they stay in the village, in their house, surrounded by family members who will inevitably be exposed. The disease spreads through the entire population. And because you can't leave, because you have to stay to tend the fields and protect the stored food, epidemic diseases can establish themselves permanently. The sanitation is making everything worse. Hunter-gatherers moved frequently enough that they never lived in their own waste. They'd use an area for a few weeks or months, and by the time waste accumulated to problematic levels, they'd moved on. By the time they returned next year, weather and decomposition had cleaned everything up. But you're not moving. You live in the same house year after year. You defecate in the same area just outside the village. 200 people producing waste every day. It piles up. It contaminates the groundwater. It attracts flies. Those flies land on your food. You drink water from wells that are slowly being contaminated by seepage from waste pits. The result is a constant background level of intestinal diseases. Dysentery, parasitic infections, bacterial gastroenteritis. Everyone in your village has intestinal parasites. Children have bloated bellies from worm infestations. Diarrheal diseases kill infants and toddlers with horrifying regularity. One bad water contamination incident can kill dozens of people in weeks. The infant mortality has at least doubled compared to hunter-gatherer populations. Maybe 30 to 40% of hunter-gatherer children died before age 5, mostly from accidents and acute infections. In your farming village, it's more like 60 to 70%. More than half of all children born don't survive to adulthood. Part of this is the disease environment. Part of it is the malnutrition. Malnourished children get sick more easily and die from infections that well-nourished children would survive. Part of it is that women are having babies more frequently, every 2 years instead of every 3 or 4. More pregnancies mean more opportunities for complications, more maternal deaths, more infants born premature or underweight. And then there's the grain storage itself. You've got storage pits and bins full of wheat and barley, thousands of pounds of grain that have to last from one harvest to the next. This stored food is supposed to provide security insurance against bad years, but it also creates problems hunter-gatherers never faced. Rodents, rats and mice that can smell the grain from miles away. They infest your village, chewing through storage bins, contaminating grain with their droppings, carrying diseases. You can hear them at night, scratching in the walls, rustling in the grain bins. You're locked in a constant battle with them, trying to keep them out, killing them when you can, but there are always more. Insects, grain weevils, moths, beetles that lay their eggs in stored grain. By midwinter, a significant portion of your stored grain is infested. You have to pick out the insects and their larvae, or just eat them. Extra protein, you tell yourself, but it's still disgusting. Mould and spoilage. If grain gets damp, it moulds. Some moulds are just unpleasant. Others are genuinely toxic, producing mycotoxins that cause liver damage, cancer, immune suppression. You don't know which is which. You just know that sometimes after eating from a particular storage bin, people get sick. Sometimes they die. So you avoid grain that looks or smells obviously bad, but some contamination is invisible. All of this means your stored food is less secure than it seems. Every harvest, you have to store not just enough grain to feed everyone until next harvest, but enough extra to account for losses to pests, spoilage, and accidents. One bad storage situation, one granary that floods or burns, and people starve, and the work never ends. Hunter-gatherers worked 15 to 20 hours a week on average. You're working 50 to 60, dawn to dusk during planting and harvest seasons. Constant maintenance of irrigation systems, fields, storage facilities. Grinding grain for hours every day, because that's how you turn hard wheat kernels into edible flour. Your hands have permanent calluses. Your back aches constantly from bending over to plant, weed and harvest. Your knees hurt from crouching in the fields. The skeletons show this too. Arthritis patterns completely different from hunter-gatherers. Early farmers have arthritis in their knees from field work, in their lower backs from carrying heavy loads, in their wrists and shoulders from grinding grain. One study of early farming women found that grinding grain for hours daily produced upper body development comparable to modern competitive rowers. That's how much physical labour it required. And you can't stop. You can't take a break. If you don't plant at the right time, the crops fail. If you don't weed regularly, the crops fail. If you don't harvest promptly when the grain ripens, it shatters and you lose it. If you don't process and store it properly, it spoils. Agriculture demands constant labour, and the punishment for not providing it is starvation. Compare this to hunting and gathering. If you didn't feel like foraging today, fine. There's food from yesterday. Tomorrow you'll get more. If hunting fails one day, you try again tomorrow or switch to fishing or gathering. There's flexibility, autonomy, choice. Agricultural life has none of that. The crops demand your labour on their schedule, not yours. There's a site in Turkey called Çatalhöyük that shows just how bad these conditions could get. It was occupied from about 9,000 years ago to 7,400 years ago. At its peak, maybe 8,000 people lived there, crammed into mud brick houses built right up against each other with no streets or alleys. You entered your house through the roof, climbing down a ladder. The skeletons from Çatalhöyük are a catalogue of agricultural health problems. Stunted growth from childhood malnutrition, severe anemia, terrible dental disease, respiratory infections from living in smoky, poorly ventilated houses, evidence of tuberculosis, leprosy, and other infectious diseases. Violent injuries, suggesting interpersonal violence was common. The people buried there were on average 4 to 5 inches shorter than hunter-gatherers from the same region a few thousand years earlier. Life expectancy had dropped. Infant mortality was catastrophic. By almost any objective health measure, these people were worse off than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. And yet the site was occupied continuously for more than 1,000 years. Generations of people lived and died there, knowing or at least suspecting that life was harder than it had been, that their grandparents had been taller and healthier, that the old stories talked about easier times. But they couldn't go back. There were 8,000 of them. The surrounding landscape had been hunted out, gathered clean, transformed into fields. They were trapped by their own numbers. This is what anthropologist Jared Diamond called the worst mistake in human history. Not because agriculture didn't work. It did work, in the sense that it allowed larger populations to survive, but it worked by making individual humans less healthy, less happy, less free. It traded quality of life for quantity of life. More people, but shorter, sicker, harder working people. And the vulnerability was building. Because all these problems, the nutritional deficiencies, the diseases, the pest infestations, the intensive labour, all of these made farming communities fragile. They could survive good years and even moderately bad years, but they had no resilience left, no margin for error. They were operating at the edge of survival, kept alive only by constant maximum effort. Hunter-gatherers had been resilient. They had diverse food sources, mobility, low population density, good health. They could absorb shocks, a drought. They moved, a disease. They spread out, a food source failure. They switched to alternatives. They had buffers, redundancy, options. Farmers had none of that. They depended entirely on their crops. They couldn't move. They couldn't switch to alternatives. They'd built a way of life that could support many more people, but only under good conditions. And conditions were about to stop being good. Because 8,200 years ago the climate was going to fail them, catastrophically, and every vulnerability they'd created, every fragility they'd built into their agricultural system, was about to be tested to destruction. The rains were going to stop, the crops were going to fail, and civilization, barely a few thousand years old, was going to teeter on the edge of complete collapse. 8,200 years ago, on an otherwise ordinary spring morning, somewhere in what's now northern Iraq, you wake up and notice something's wrong with the weather. The spring rains, which should have started weeks ago, haven't come. The sky's clear, has been clear for days. The fields you planted with barley 6 weeks ago are starting to look stressed. The young plants are yellowing, wilting in the dry soil. You're not too worried yet. Late rains happen sometimes. The weather varies from year to year. Maybe the rains will come next week. You've got grain stored from last year's harvest, enough to last until this year's crop comes in. Assuming it comes in, you'll be fine, but the rains don't come next week, or the week after, or the month after. Spring turns to summer, and the sky stays stubbornly, impossibly clear. The barley dies in the fields. You replant with some of your stored seed, hoping for late-season moisture. Nothing. The soil is dust. The irrigation canals that usually flow from the river are reduced to trickles. The river itself is running lower than anyone can remember. By fall, you're eating your stored grain, the reserve meant to last through winter and spring until next harvest. You're rationing now, making it stretch. 1 meal a day instead of 2. The children are always hungry. Other villages are in the same situation. There's no surplus to trade for. Everyone's storage is dwindling. Winter brings no relief. The rains that usually fall in winter don't come. The springs that feed the river are drying up. By the second spring, people are eating things they shouldn't. Grass seeds that are barely edible. Roots that cause stomach pain. Some are trying to hunt, but the game disappeared months ago, following the water to wherever water still exists. By the second summer, people are dying. The elderly first, then the very young, then anyone weakened by illness or injury. Your village, which had 200 people when this started, is down to maybe 120. Families have left, trying to find better conditions elsewhere. You hear rumours that coastal areas still have water, that some places in the mountains got rain, but travelling is dangerous when you are already weak from hunger, and the drought just continues. Year 3, Year 4, Year 5. The sky stays clear, the rain doesn't fall, the river becomes a series of disconnected pools, then a dry channel with water only in the deepest holes. The fields are abandoned, the soil blown away by wind, the village is collapsing, structures falling apart because there's no one with energy to maintain them. By year 10, your village is abandoned. Everyone who could leave has left. The rest died. You're somewhere else now, maybe on the coast, maybe in the mountains, part of a refugee group that's barely surviving. And you have no idea if this will ever end. No idea if the rains will ever return. For all you know, this is permanent. The world has changed and agriculture is over. This isn't fiction. This happened. 8,200 years ago, a climate event hit the Fertile Crescent and surrounding regions that was, until modern times, the most significant climate disruption of the entire Holocene period. Scientists call it the 8.2 kiloyear event, named for its timing 8,200 years before the year 2000. And it nearly ended civilization before civilization had really begun. Here's what happened, as best as scientists can reconstruct it from ice cores, lake sediments, and ocean floor samples. The mechanism started thousands of miles away from the Fertile Crescent, in North America. During the last ice age, massive ice sheets covered much of Canada and the northern United States. As the planet warmed and these ice sheets melted, the meltwater had to go somewhere. Much of it pooled in a giant glacial lake called Lake Agassiz, sitting roughly where Lake Winnipeg and the surrounding region of Canada is today. At its maximum, Lake Agassiz was larger than all the modern Great Lakes combined. It held more water than any lake that exists on Earth today, and it was held back by melting ice dams. Around 8,200 years ago, one of these ice dams failed catastrophically. The entire lake, thousands of cubic miles of fresh water, drained into the North Atlantic Ocean in a matter of months or perhaps even weeks. The largest flood in human history, and possibly in Earth's history. A pulse of fresh water so massive it temporarily shut down the ocean currents that regulate global climate. The key circulation system is called the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. Warm salty water from the tropics flows north along the surface. When it reaches the North Atlantic, it cools, becomes denser, and sinks to the deep ocean. This sinking pulls more warm water north, creating a conveyor belt that moves heat from the equator toward the poles. But the circulation depends on the water being salty enough to sink. When Lake Agassiz dumped all that fresh water into the North Atlantic, it diluted the salt content. The water stopped sinking. The conveyor belt slowed dramatically or possibly stopped entirely, and without that heat transport, the climate changed abruptly. Ice cores from Greenland show the temperature signal clearly. Within a few decades, maybe faster, temperatures across the North Atlantic region dropped by 3 to 7 degrees Celsius. That's a huge shift, especially concentrated in such a short time. The cooling extended across Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, and into Central Asia. But temperature wasn't the only change, perhaps not even the main change. The disruption to ocean circulation altered atmospheric patterns, shifting precipitation belts. The Mediterranean region, including the Fertile Crescent, experienced a massive sustained drought. Not a few dry years, not even a decade, 2 centuries of dramatically reduced precipitation, the worst mega-drought of the Holocene. The evidence is written in multiple lines of geological data. Lake levels throughout the region dropped dramatically. Dead sea levels fell by more than 100 feet. Lakes in Turkey and Iran that had been stable for thousands of years dried up entirely or became shallow hypersaline ponds. Pollen records show forest die-off, grasslands turning to semi-desert, wetlands disappearing. Cave formations, stalagmites and stalactites that grow in layers like tree rings show a distinct growth interruption during this period. They need dripping water to grow. When the drought hit, they stopped growing for decades or centuries. When you slice them open and look at the growth layers under microscope, there's a clear gap marking the 8.2 kiloyear event, and the human archaeological record shows exactly what you'd expect from a civilization-ending climate catastrophe. Settlement abandonment on a massive scale. Sites across northern Mesopotamia, Syria, Anatolia, and the Levant that had been continuously occupied for centuries or millennia were suddenly deserted. The archaeological layers show thriving villages, then a sharp break, then nothing for decades, or sometimes centuries. Tel Sabi Abyad in northern Syria is one of the clearest examples. It was a substantial farming village, maybe 300 to 400 people, with elaborate mud brick architecture, sophisticated pottery, evidence of long-distance trade. The site had been occupied for generations. Then around 8,200 years ago it was abandoned abruptly. Not destroyed by warfare or fire, just abandoned. People left, and the buildings slowly collapsed from neglect. When excavations resume in the archaeological record a century or two later, it's a completely different culture. Different pottery styles, different house architecture, different burial practices. The original population didn't return. Either they died out or they scattered so completely that their cultural identity was lost. New people, possibly from regions less affected by the drought, eventually moved into the area. This pattern repeats across hundreds of sites. The pre-pottery Neolithic bee culture, which had dominated the Levant for more than 1,000 years, effectively collapses. Population estimates for the region drop by 60 to 70% or more. Whole settlement systems disappear. Trade networks that had connected communities across hundreds of miles break down entirely. The collapse wasn't limited to the Fertile Crescent. The 8.2 kiloyear event was global in scope, though the effects varied by region. North Africa experienced severe drought. The Sahara, which had been relatively wet during the early Holocene, began its transformation into the desert we know today. Hunter-gatherer populations in the region either migrated or died. Europe experienced cooling and disruption to agriculture, which was just beginning to spread northward from the Mediterranean. Some farming communities collapsed. Others managed to hold on, but expansion stopped for centuries. In East Asia, monsoon patterns shifted, affecting early agricultural societies in China. Global sea levels, which had been rising steadily as ice sheets melted, suddenly stabilized for a few centuries as cooling slowed the melting. But nowhere was hit as hard as the Fertile Crescent, the birthplace of agriculture, the region with the highest concentration of early farming settlements. Because this was where agriculture had gone furthest, where populations were most dependent on crops, where the vulnerability was greatest. And here's the crucial part. Hunter-gatherers would have survived this just fine. It would have been difficult, certainly. The drought would have stressed plant and animal populations, but hunter-gatherers were mobile. They exploited diverse resources. They could follow the water to wherever water remained. They could shift, from plants to animals to fish to shellfish, depending on what was available. They could spread out across larger territories when resources became scarce in any one area. The drought would have been an inconvenience, not an existential crisis. They would have adjusted their seasonal rounds, maybe spent more time in highland areas where spring still flowed, or in coastal regions where marine resources provided reliable food. They would have survived, and their populations would have remained relatively stable. But the farmers couldn't move. They were tied to their fields, their stored grain, their permanent villages, and when the crops failed, when the stored grain ran out, when there was no harvest year after year, they had no alternatives. They couldn't just switch to hunting because the game populations around their settlements had been depleted years ago. They couldn't forage effectively because they'd lost much of that knowledge, and besides, the wild plants were dying too. They were trapped by their own success. The population growth agriculture had enabled meant there were now far too many people to support through hunting and gathering. A region that might have sustained a few thousand hunter-gatherers now had tens of thousands of farmers. When agriculture failed, the vast majority had no viable survival strategy, so they died, not all at once, not everywhere equally. But across the region, population levels crashed. Some groups tried to migrate, abandoning their villages and moving toward the coast or into mountain valleys. But these refugees were entering territories already occupied by other struggling populations. There weren't enough resources to support everyone. The skeletal evidence from the few burials that occur during this period shows catastrophic health decline, severe malnutrition, growth arrest features indicating months or years of starvation conditions, increased violence, mass graves suggesting rapid mortality events, possibly from disease outbreaks in starving populations, and this went on for decades. That's what's so hard to grasp about the 8.2 kilo year event. It wasn't a bad year or even a bad decade. It was 2 centuries of climate disruption, 8 human generations born into drought, dying in drought, never knowing if the rains would ever return. Imagine living through that. You're born into a world where your parents tell you about how things used to be, about rains that came reliably, about harvests that filled the storage bins, about villages full of people. But you never see it. Your whole life is rationing, hunger, watching people die, watching settlements shrink. You have children, and you can't feed them adequately. They grow up stunted, weak, sick. You keep planting when you can, hoping against hope that this year will be different. Sometimes you get a little rain, enough for a partial crop, enough to survive another year, but never enough to rebuild, to recover, to get ahead. You're always on the edge, always one more drought year away from complete collapse, and you can't even leave. Not really. Because where would you go? The drought is regional, affecting everyone. Moving just means dying somewhere else, probably fighting with other desperate populations for access to whatever water and food remains. Your best chance is to stay put, eke out survival from whatever resources still exist in your familiar territory, and pray to whatever gods you believe in that the climate will change back. Some populations did survive. Some settlements managed to hold on through the crisis, though dramatically reduced in size. They did it through a combination of desperate strategies. Some returned partially to hunting and gathering, supplementing failed crops with whatever wild resources they could find. Some developed more sophisticated irrigation systems, channeling every drop of available water to their most essential crops. Some moved to permanent water sources, rivers or springs, and defended those resources violently against other groups trying to access them. Archaeological evidence from a few continuously occupied sites shows how people adapted. They diversified their crops, planting more drought-resistant varieties. They invested enormous labour in water management, digging wells, building cisterns, creating irrigation networks that let them farm even with minimal rainfall. They reduced their populations through some combination of high mortality, reduced fertility and emigration. But most settlements didn't survive. The archaeological record is unambiguous. The pre-pottery Neolithic bee culture that had flourished for more than 1,000 years effectively ends during the 8.2 kiloyear event. When settlement patterns resume in the centuries after the climate stabilizes, they're different. Smaller villages, more dispersed settlement patterns, different cultural markers. And here's what's remarkable. This should have been the end. Early agriculture had proven to be catastrophically vulnerable. It had created populations that couldn't survive climate disruption. It had failed its first major test. Rational human beings, having seen what happened, should have abandoned agriculture as too risky and returned to the hunting and gathering lifestyle that had sustained their ancestors for hundreds of thousands of years. But they didn't. They couldn't. Because even though most of the population died, even though most settlements collapsed, enough survived that when the drought finally ended, when the rains returned around 8,000 years ago, there were still farmers, still people who knew how to plant and harvest crops, still communities organized around agricultural production, and those survivors, having just barely made it through the worst climate disaster of the Holocene, did something that seems almost insane. They doubled down on agriculture. They expanded it. They intensified it. They developed new technologies and strategies to make it more productive and more resilient. They rebuilt the population. They established new settlements. Within a few centuries after the 8.2 kiloyear event ended, the Fertile Crescent was more densely populated with farmers than it had been before the crisis. Agriculture had survived. Civilization had survived. Barely, but it had survived. And that survival, improbable as it was, set humanity on an irreversible course toward the complex societies, the cities, the technologies, the civilization we have today. The crisis should have killed agriculture. It should have proven that this new way of life was too fragile, too vulnerable, too dependent on stable conditions. Instead, it proved something else. It proved that humans, even when trapped in a survival strategy that's objectively terrible, will find ways to adapt, to innovate, to cling to survival against impossible odds. The question is how. How did they survive when everything was stacked against them? What strategies let enough communities hold on through 2 centuries of climate catastrophe? And why, having survived by the narrowest possible margin, did they choose to continue down the agricultural path rather than returning to the proven sustainability of hunting and gathering? Those answers reveal something fundamental about human nature and about the irreversible nature of the agricultural transition. So you survived. Against all odds, through 2 centuries of drought and famine and death, your community held on. Not the same community exactly. Most of the people who were alive when the drought started are dead now. Some starved. Some left and never returned. Some died from diseases that swept through populations weakened by malnutrition. But some survived. Maybe 20 or 30 people from what had been a village of 200, and slowly, impossibly, the rains are returning. It's been 8,000 years now since the drought began. The climate is stabilizing. The Mediterranean weather patterns are re-establishing themselves. The winter rains come more reliably. The springs that had dried to trickles are flowing again. The river, which had been reduced to disconnected pools, is a river once more. You can plant crops and actually expect them to grow. But you're not the same farmers your great-great-grandparents were. You can't be. They had relied entirely on wheat and barley, on rain-fed agriculture, on the assumption that the climate would remain stable. That assumption killed most of them. If you're going to survive, if you're going to rebuild, you need to do things differently. The first and most obvious change is water. You can't trust the rain anymore. Even now that it's returned, you remember the stories, or you experienced it yourself. The rain can stop, for decades, for generations. So you need to control water, to capture it, to move it, to ensure your crops get moisture even when the sky stays dry. This is where irrigation becomes not just helpful but essential. The concept isn't new. Even before the drought, some communities had dug simple channels to direct water from streams to their fields. But now you're taking it further, investing massive amounts of labour in creating more sophisticated water management systems. In southern Mesopotamia, communities are digging canals from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to their fields. Not just small ditches, but substantial channels that can carry water for miles. They're building weirs and dams to control water flow. They're creating basin irrigation systems where water is diverted into low-lying fields, allowed to soak the soil, then drained away. This is the emergence of the Samarra culture, named after an archaeological site in Iraq. The Samarra people, living between about 8,200 and 7,700 years ago, developed some of the earliest sophisticated irrigation agriculture. Their pottery shows characteristic designs, geometric patterns, and stylized animals. But more important than their art is their engineering. They built settlements along the rivers, but located their fields inland, connected by irrigation canals. This let them farm areas that would otherwise be too dry for reliable agriculture. It also meant they could plant multiple crops per year in some fields, using irrigation to provide water during dry seasons. The labour investment was enormous, digging and maintaining miles of canals, but it paid off in reliable harvests even in dry years. Further north, in what's now northern Iraq and Syria, the Halaf culture was developing different solutions to the same problem. The Halaf people, flourishing from about 8,100 to 7,400 years ago, built settlements around permanent water sources, springs, rivers, dependable wells. They didn't rely on rain, they positioned themselves where water existed naturally and would continue to exist even in drought conditions. Their pottery is distinctive and beautiful, fine-painted ceramics with elaborate geometric and figural designs. But again, the pottery is just the visible marker of a culture. What really mattered was their survival strategy. They diversified. They didn't depend entirely on wheat and barley. They incorporated more legumes into their crop rotation. Lentils, peas, chickpeas. These plants had multiple advantages. First, legumes are more drought-resistant than wheat or barley. They can survive on less water. In a region still recovering from a 2-century drought, this matters. Second, legumes fix nitrogen in the soil. They have a symbiotic relationship with bacteria that convert atmospheric nitrogen into forms plants can use. After a few seasons of growing legumes in a field, the soil is actually more fertile than it was before. You can alternate legume crops with grain crops and maintain soil fertility without letting fields lie fallow as long. Third, legumes provide nutritional benefits that wheat and barley don't. They're high in protein. Remember how the early farmers were protein deficient, suffering from anemia and poor growth? Adding legumes to the diet helps solve that problem, not completely, but enough to matter. The populations that incorporate substantial legumes into their diets are noticeably healthier than those that remain dependent on grain alone. But perhaps the most important innovation is diversification beyond annual crops. This is when tree crops become central to Mediterranean agriculture. Olives, grapes, dates, figs, pistachios. These perennial crops have massive advantages over annual grains. Once established, trees produce for decades or even centuries without needing to be replanted every year. They're more drought-resistant than annual crops because they develop deep root systems that can access water unavailable to shallow-rooted grains. They produce crops even in years when rainfall is insufficient for grain cultivation. And many tree crops can be stored for extended periods. Dried dates and figs last for years. Olives can be pressed into oil that stays edible for months or years. The earliest evidence of deliberate olive cultivation dates to around 8,500 years ago in the Levant. Wild olives had always existed in the region, but now people were selecting for characteristics that made them more useful. Larger fruits, higher oil content, trees that produced more reliably. The same process of unconscious selection that had domesticated wheat and barley thousands of years earlier was now being applied to tree crops. Date palms in southern Mesopotamia were being cultivated by around 8,000 years ago. Dates are incredibly productive. A mature date palm can produce over 200 pounds of fruit per year. The fruit is sweet, calorie-dense, and stores well when dried. In a desert environment where grain agriculture is marginal at best, date palms can be the difference between survival and starvation. These tree crops did something else crucial. They smoothed out the seasonal peaks and valleys of food availability. Grain is harvested once a year, all at once. You have abundance during and immediately after harvest, then declining supplies until the next harvest. But different tree crops ripen at different times: almonds in early summer, grapes and figs in late summer, olives in fall, dates in fall and winter. If you have a mix of tree crops alongside your grain fields, you have food coming in throughout the year, not just one massive harvest that has to last 12 months. The people rebuilding agriculture after the crisis weren't stupid. They'd learned from near extinction, so they were incorporating every strategy they could think of to make their food supply more secure. Irrigation to control water, legumes to diversify crops and improve soil, tree crops for long-term production and drought resistance. And something else that might seem surprising: they maintained hunting and gathering knowledge. The communities that survived the 8.2 kill-a-year event best were the ones that didn't fully abandon traditional subsistence strategies. When the crops failed, they fell back on hunting and foraging. It saved their lives. So even as they rebuilt agriculture, they made sure to preserve that knowledge, to pass it to the next generation, to keep those skills alive. Archaeological sites from this recovery period show mixed subsistence strategies: animal bones from both domesticated species, sheep and goats, and wild game, deer, gazelle, wild boar. Plant remains from both cultivated crops and wild collected seeds, nuts, and fruits. Stone tools designed for hunting alongside agricultural implements. These people were hedging their bets, maintaining multiple strategies simultaneously. In modern terms, they were building resilience into their food system. Resilience means the ability to absorb shocks and continue functioning. A resilient system has redundancy, diversity, multiple pathways to the same goal. If one element fails, others can compensate. The early farmers before the crisis had no resilience. They depended entirely on grain crops grown with rainwater. When that failed, they had nothing. The survivors built resilience back in: multiple crops, multiple water sources, multiple food procurement strategies. It meant more work, certainly. You had to maintain irrigation systems and plant diverse crops and still spend time hunting and gathering. But it also meant security. If the grain crop failed, you had legumes and tree crops. If those failed, you had wild resources. If local resources were insufficient, you had trade networks. Trade became increasingly important during and after the crisis. Before the drought, trade existed but was limited. Communities exchanged exotic materials, obsidian for stone tools, shells for ornaments, special types of clay for pottery. Useful items, but not survival necessities. After the crisis, trade networks expanded and included essentials: grain from regions with surplus moving to regions with shortfalls, dried fish from coastal communities heading inland, preserved dates from southern Mesopotamia being traded northward. This trade did something crucial. It spread risk across space. If your region had a bad year but neighbouring regions did well, you could trade for what you needed. If everyone had bad years simultaneously, well, that was catastrophic. But it was less likely if you were connected to communities across a wide enough area. Different regions had different microclimates, different rainfall patterns. A drought that hit one area might spare another 100 miles away. The Halaf culture shows extensive trade networks. Halaf pottery, that distinctive painted ware, is found across an enormous area from eastern Anatolia to northern Mesopotamia to the Levant. That distribution suggests either the movement of Halaf people themselves or extensive exchange networks connecting different communities. Either way, it meant goods and information, and presumably also risk-sharing assistance flowing across hundreds of miles. Pottery itself became more sophisticated during this period, and that mattered for survival. Better pottery meant better storage. Earlier pottery had been relatively porous, not ideal for long-term storage of grain or liquids. But new firing techniques produced harder, less porous ceramics. Some potters discovered that coating pottery with a slip, a thin layer of fine clay before firing, made it nearly waterproof. This sounds like a minor technical improvement, but it meant you could store grain more reliably, with less loss to moisture and pests. It meant you could store liquids like oil and wine. It meant your insurance stores, the food you were keeping for emergencies, actually remained usable for longer. Better storage technology increased resilience. So did architecture. Houses were being built with better ventilation, which reduced smoke exposure and respiratory disease. Storage facilities were being designed with raised floors to reduce pest access. Granaries were being built more robustly, with better protection against rain and rodents. These aren't dramatic innovations. No one was inventing writing or the wheel yet. But incremental improvements in basic technologies added up to significantly better survival chances. Around 7,500 years ago, a new cultural pattern emerged in southern Mesopotamia called the Ubaid. The Ubaid period would last for more than 2,000 years and would see agriculture become more productive and more secure than ever before. This is when irrigation agriculture really comes into its own, when the techniques developed during the crisis period are refined and expanded. Ubaid settlements were larger than what had come before. Some approached town size, maybe 1,000 or more people. They show evidence of public architecture, buildings that seem to have served communal functions, possibly temples or administrative centres. The dead were buried in cemeteries with varying amounts of grave goods, suggesting some degree of social differentiation, though nothing approaching the extreme inequality that would come later. But what really characterised the Ubaid period was agricultural sophistication. These people were masters of irrigation. They built extensive canal systems. They managed water levels carefully, preventing over-irrigation that could lead to salinisation, a process where dissolved salts accumulate in soil and eventually make it infertile. They used crop rotation systematically. They maintained diverse crops. They combined farming with fishing, herding, and limited hunting and gathering. The result was agricultural communities that were genuinely more resilient than what had existed before the crisis. Not invulnerable, they would face their own collapses eventually, but much more capable of weathering normal year-to-year climate variability. They could handle a few dry years without catastrophe. They had storage systems that could buffer them through short-term shortages. They had trade networks that let them acquire what they couldn't produce locally. Population levels began rising again. Settlements multiplied. Agriculture expanded into new regions. In Europe, farming was spreading westward from Greece through the Balkans, reaching Central Europe by around 7,500 years ago. In Egypt, the Nile Valley was seeing more intensive agriculture, taking advantage of the annual flood cycle to fertilize fields. In East Asia, rice and millet cultivation in China was becoming more sophisticated. This expansion wasn't just population growth pushing people into new territories, though that was part of it. It was also the spread of information, of successful strategies, of technologies that had been proven to work. Irrigation techniques developed in Mesopotamia were being adapted to other environments. Crop combinations that provided resilience in one region were being tried in others. The disaster had forced innovation, and that innovation was now spreading. There's a temptation to see this recovery and expansion as a triumph, as proof that agriculture was the right choice after all, and in some sense, it was a triumph. Human communities had faced near extinction from climate catastrophe, and had survived through ingenuity, hard work, and sheer stubborn refusal to give up. That's genuinely impressive. But we should also recognise what was lost. The resilience strategies that allowed survival after the 8.2 kilo-year event were all ways of making agriculture more like hunting and gathering. Diversify food sources, maintain mobility and trade networks, keep traditional knowledge alive, use multiple strategies simultaneously. These were the principles that had made hunting and gathering successful for hundreds of thousands of years. Agriculture had forced humans to abandon those principles. Monoculture instead of diversity, sedentism instead of mobility, specialization instead of generalist knowledge. The crisis proved those changes were dangerous, so the survivors partially reverted to older strategies, wrapping them around agriculture to make it less vulnerable. And it worked. But it didn't change the fundamental reality. Agriculturalists were still shorter than hunter-gatherers, still sicker, still working longer hours, still living in disease-ridden permanent settlements, still dependent on just a few crop species for survival. The improvements made agriculture survivable. They didn't make it preferable to the lifestyle it had replaced. The communities rebuilding after the drought knew this at some level. They could see that their ancestors had been taller and healthier. The stories passed down through generations told of easier times before agriculture, but they couldn't go back. The population was already too large. The knowledge had been partially lost. The landscape had been transformed by agricultural activities. And more than anything, The alternative, the hunter-gatherer lifestyle, required low population density. You couldn't support thousands of people per valley through hunting and gathering. You could only support dozens, so they continued forward on the agricultural path. But they did it with hard-won wisdom about what worked and what didn't. They built resilience into their systems, they maintained diversity, they refused to become completely dependent on any single strategy. And for a while, it worked well enough that agriculture not only survived but began to thrive again. Within 1,000 years of the crisis ending, the Fertile Crescent was more densely populated than ever before. Within 2,000 years, the first true cities would emerge, places like Uruk with tens of thousands of inhabitants, sustained by sophisticated agricultural systems. The gamble hadn't just survived, it had paid off in ways the early farmers could never have imagined. But they would also discover that success brought its own problems, and that the vulnerabilities they thought they'd solved would return in new and unexpected forms. Agriculture survived. More than that, agriculture was succeeding. By 7,000 years ago, the crisis had passed into memory, something the grandparents talked about but that most living people had never experienced. The climate had stabilized, the populations were growing, the settlements were expanding, the fields were productive, everything should have been getting better, and in some ways it was. There was more food than before, more people were surviving to adulthood, communities were larger, which meant more social connections, more potential marriage partners, more people to share labour and knowledge with. Technologies were improving steadily. Pottery was better, tools were more specialised, houses were more substantial. By any measure of material success, agricultural societies were thriving, but something else was happening too, something that no one had planned for or anticipated, something that would have been impossible in hunter-gatherer societies, but that emerged inevitably once agriculture was established. Agriculture was creating inequality, and inequality was creating violence, and violence was creating social structures of domination and coercion that humans had never lived under before. Let me show you how this happened, because it didn't start with malice or exploitation. It started with something that seemed positive. Surplus. You're a farmer in a good year. Your wheat harvest was excellent. Your barley fields produced abundantly. Your lentils and chickpeas came in well. You filled your storage bins and you still have grain left over. You've got surplus, more food than you and your family can eat before the next harvest. This is good, right? This is security. This is wealth. In a hunter-gatherer society, surplus doesn't really exist. You can't accumulate more food than you can carry or consume before it spoils. If you kill a large animal, you share it with the whole band because there's no way to preserve it all for yourself. If you find a particularly productive stand of plants, you harvest what you need and leave the rest because carrying extra serves no purpose. Resources are abundant and shared roughly equally, but farming creates surplus that can be stored, and once you can store surplus, you can accumulate it. Year after year, if you're good at farming, or lucky with weather, or have particularly fertile land, you accumulate more stored food than your neighbours. You have wealth. And wealth, it turns out, changes everything. First, wealth means power. If your neighbour has a bad harvest and faces starvation, they can come to you for help. You can give or loan them grain from your surplus. That creates obligation. They owe you now. Next year, or whenever you need something, they'll remember your generosity. Or if you're less generous, they'll remember that too. Either way, you have leverage over them that you didn't have before. Wealth also means you can support people who don't farm. If you have enough surplus, you can feed a craftsperson who spends their time making pottery, or tools instead of growing food. Or you can feed someone who organises community labour projects, or who performs religious ceremonies, or who settles disputes. In exchange for feeding them, they provide services to you and the community. But you, the wealthy one, gain status and influence by supporting these specialists. Over time, some families accumulate more wealth than others. Maybe they have better land. Maybe they're more skilled farmers. Maybe they just got lucky with weather several years in a row. Whatever the reason, disparities emerge. Some households have full storage bins, others are barely getting by. And these disparities, once they emerge, tend to persist and expand, because wealth generates more wealth. If you have surplus grain, you can plant more fields next year. You can support more family members who can work those fields. You can acquire more land. You can trade surplus for other valuable items. Your wealth grows. Meanwhile, the poor family that's barely surviving can't expand. They can't invest. They stay poor or get poorer. The archaeological evidence for this growing inequality is unmistakable. Early farming settlements show very little differentiation in houses or grave goods. Everyone lives in similar structures, gets buried with similar objects. But by 7,000 years ago, that's changing. At Ubaid period sites in Mesopotamia, you start seeing differences. Some houses are larger than others. Some are built with better materials. Some areas of settlements seem wealthier than others. Burials start showing differentiation too. Some people are buried with abundant grave goods, pottery vessels, jewellery, tools. Others get minimal burial offerings. This isn't random. The wealthy burials cluster in certain areas, certain family groups. Wealth is becoming hereditary. Rich families stay rich. Poor families stay poor. And then inequality creates something that would have been impossible before agriculture. Property crime. In a hunter-gatherer society, there's nothing worth stealing. Everyone owns only what they can carry and everyone has roughly similar possessions. Stealing someone's tools or ornaments gains you nothing because you already have your own. But once some people have large stores of grain and others don't, stealing becomes rational. If you're hungry and your neighbour has bins full of wheat, taking that wheat solves your problem. So now you need to protect your property. You can't just wander away from your settlement because someone might steal your stored food. You need to guard it. Or you need social rules and enforcement mechanisms to prevent theft. Either way, you need systems of social control that never existed before. And if you're the wealthy person with lots of surplus, you can hire or coerce others to protect your property. You can form alliances with other wealthy families. You can create hierarchies where some people have authority to punish thieves or settle disputes. Power structures emerge naturally from wealth inequality. But property crime is just the beginning. The real explosion of violence comes from warfare, not raiding or small-scale conflict, which existed even among hunter-gatherers occasionally, but organised, systematic, large-scale violence between communities. And the driver is the same thing: surplus, stored wealth, agricultural land. Before agriculture, there was little reason for one group to attack another. Hunter-gatherer territories were fluid. Resources were dispersed. If you wanted what another group had, you could usually just move to a different area and find similar resources. Violence occasionally happened over personal disputes or competition for mates, but systematic warfare made no sense. Agriculture changed that calculation completely. Agricultural land isn't equally distributed. Some land is more fertile, some has better water access, some is easier to work, and land is fixed. You can't move your fields, so if I want your productive land, I have to take it from you by force. If I want your stored grain, I have to raid your settlement. Your wealth, your food security, your survival are now things I can take through violence. And because you're sedentary, I know where to find you. You can't just disappear into the landscape like hunter-gatherers could. Your settlement is permanent. Your fields are visible. Your stored food is concentrated in granaries. You're a target, and you can't escape by moving. The skeletal evidence for increased violence is stark and unambiguous. Studies comparing hunter-gatherer skeletons to early farmer skeletons consistently show massive increases in violent trauma. One comprehensive analysis found that rates of violent death increased by more than 1,200% with the adoption of agriculture. 1,200%. That's not a gradual change. That's a transformation in the fundamental nature of human society. The violence shows up in multiple forms: healed fractures to forearms, defensive injuries from blocking blows, skull fractures from being clubbed or struck with stones, projectile points embedded in bones, indicating death by arrow or spear, cut marks on bones from scalping or dismemberment, mass graves with evidence of massacre, entire communities killed simultaneously. One site in Sudan, called Jebel Sahaba, dating to about 13,000 years ago, is sometimes cited as evidence of pre-agricultural warfare. It's a cemetery with 61 individuals, many showing signs of violent death. It's horrific. But it's also notable precisely because it's so rare. You can point to this one site from thousands of years of hunter-gatherer occupation across vast territories. After agriculture, you find evidence like this constantly, at site after site, across every region where farming exists. In Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in Europe as agriculture spreads there, the pattern repeats. Settlements start showing defensive architecture: walls, ditches, palisades. Communities invest enormous labour in protecting themselves, labour that could have gone to food production, but instead goes to defence. The very existence of these fortifications tells you warfare has become common enough to justify the cost. And it's not just sporadic raiding. By 6,000 years ago, you see evidence of organised, sustained warfare. Settlements destroyed by fire, mass graves of men, women and children killed together. Entire populations wiped out. At a site called Hamukar in Syria, dating to about 5,500 years ago, archaeologists found evidence of a massive battle. The defensive walls were breached, buildings were burned, thousands of clay balls used as sling ammunition littered the site. This wasn't a raid. This was a siege, an organised attack by a large force against a fortified settlement. Why? Because Hamukar was prosperous. It had productive agricultural land, it had stored food, it had wealth, and someone else wanted that wealth badly enough to attack in force, to sustain a siege, to destroy the settlement when they couldn't capture it intact. This is warfare as organised theft, violence as economic strategy, and it becomes increasingly common as agricultural societies accumulate more wealth. The violence creates new forms of social organisation. You need warriors now, specialists in violence to defend your community or attack others. You need leaders to organise defence and coordinate attacks. You need hierarchies of command. In a hunter-gatherer band, leadership is informal and temporary. Someone might lead a particular hunt or resolve a specific dispute, but they have no permanent authority. Everyone is fundamentally equal. In agricultural societies facing constant warfare, that changes. Warriors gain status and power. Successful war leaders accumulate followers and resources. Over time, some of these leaders become permanent, their authority extending beyond military matters into other areas of life. Chiefdoms emerge, societies where one family or lineage has hereditary power over others. The social equality that characterized human societies for hundreds of thousands of years disappears within a few thousand years of agriculture, and warfare enables something else that would have been almost impossible before: slavery. In a mobile hunter-gatherer society, captives make no sense. You can't force someone to accompany you across the landscape. They'll escape at the first opportunity, and they can't carry enough to justify the effort of controlling them. But in agricultural settlements, captives can be forced to work. They can't easily escape because surrounding territories are occupied by other groups who won't welcome refugees, and their labour is valuable. They can work your fields, process your grain, build your houses, all while you and your family benefit from their production. The earliest clear evidence of slavery appears in agricultural societies. You see skeletons that show patterns of extreme physical labour combined with poor nutrition, suggesting they were worked hard but not fed well, the classic markers of enslaved status. You see references in the earliest written records appearing around 5,200 years ago to captives and slaves. The Sumerian language has specific words for slaves, distinguishing them from free people, and once slavery exists, it creates incentives for more warfare. You attack other communities not just for their stored food and land, but for the people themselves. Captives become property, tradable goods with economic value. War becomes not just conquest, but also slave raiding. The cycle of violence intensifies. The violence and slavery and inequality affect gender relations too, creating forms of patriarchy that didn't exist in most hunter-gatherer societies. In mobile foraging bands, women's contribution through gathering is essential and valued. Women have autonomy and voice in decisions, but agriculture changes the equation. First, agricultural work, especially plough agriculture when that develops, favours male upper body strength. Men become the primary field labourers. Women's role shifts more toward processing, cooking, child rearing. Their economic contribution becomes less visible, less valued. Second, with stored wealth and property, inheritance becomes important. Who gets the fields? Who gets the stored grain? Who gets the house? These questions don't exist in hunter-gatherer societies because there's no property to inherit, but in agricultural societies they're critical. And patrilineal inheritance, passing property from fathers to sons, becomes common because it keeps wealth within male lineages and, in stratified violent societies, helps powerful families maintain control. Third, warfare and violence favour male dominance. Warriors are mostly men, and warriors gain status and power. As military concerns become more important, male voices dominate decision-making. Women's autonomy declines. Archaeological evidence shows this shift. Early farming societies show relatively equal treatment of men and women in burials, and little evidence of gender-based violence. By 6,000 years ago, that's changing. Wealthy burials become predominantly male. Female skeletons start showing evidence of interpersonal violence at higher rates. Some female skeletons show patterns of trauma suggesting domestic violence, repeated injuries that healed and then recurred. This isn't universal. Some agricultural societies maintained relatively egalitarian gender relations, but the trend is clear. Agriculture created conditions, stored wealth, property inheritance, constant warfare that favoured the emergence of patriarchal social structures. Systems of male dominance that would persist in most agricultural societies for thousands of years emerged from the practical realities of farming and the violence farming created. And there's another cost that becomes apparent in this period: environmental degradation. Agriculture doesn't just transform society, it transforms the landscape, and not always for the better. You need wood, lots of wood, for cooking fires, for heating, for building houses and boats, for firing pottery, for making tools. A settled population of hundreds or thousands uses far more wood than a mobile hunter-gatherer band. So you cut down the forests around your settlement. At first it seems fine. The forests are vast. You're just cutting trees near your village. But you're not the only settlement. And you're not just cutting a few trees each year. You're clearing entire areas, converting forest to agricultural fields. And forest doesn't regrow quickly, especially in Mediterranean climates with dry summers. Within a few generations, the forests around your settlement are gone, the hillsides are bare, and this creates cascading problems. Without tree roots to hold soil in place, erosion accelerates. When rain falls on bare hillsides, it washes soil downslope. The fertile topsoil, built up over thousands of years, disappears in a few decades. Gullies form, the land becomes less productive. Fields that once produced abundant crops now yield less each year. Mesopotamia has a particular problem. The irrigation that saved agricultural societies during and after the 8.2 kiloyear event creates a long-term threat: salinization. When you irrigate in a hot, dry climate, some water evaporates from the soil surface, leaving behind dissolved salts. Over decades and centuries, salt accumulates. Eventually, the soil becomes so salty that most crops can't grow. This process was already beginning in southern Mesopotamia by 6,000 years ago. Agricultural productivity in some long-irrigated areas was declining. Fields that had fed communities for generations were becoming infertile. The solution was to abandon those fields and open new ones, but that just spread the problem. Each generation left behind damaged land and moved to new areas, which they would also damage over time. The earliest written records from Mesopotamia, appearing around 5,200 years ago, mentioned salinization as a recognized problem. By 4,000 years ago, agricultural yields in southern Mesopotamia had declined significantly compared to their peak. The very technique that had made intensive agriculture possible was slowly destroying the land's productivity. Similar patterns emerged wherever agriculture intensified. In the Levant, deforestation and overgrazing led to soil erosion. In North Africa, agricultural expansion into marginal lands contributed to desertification. In Europe, as farming spread, forests were cleared on a massive scale. Each community thought it was just using resources sustainably, but collectively agriculture was degrading the landscapes that supported it. Hunter-gatherers had environmental impacts too, certainly. Fire management practices altered ecosystems. Hunting contributed to some megafauna extinctions, but the scale was completely different. A mobile population of a few dozen people has limited impact. A settled population of thousands fundamentally transforms the landscape. And the agricultural societies couldn't stop. They needed more food to support growing populations. They needed more land to make up for declining productivity of older fields. They needed more wood for expanding settlements. The environmental degradation and the agricultural expansion fed each other in a destructive cycle. By 6,000 years ago, less than 4,000 years after agriculture was established, the costs were becoming undeniable. People were shorter and sicker than their hunter-gatherer ancestors had been. They worked longer hours. They lived under hierarchies of domination. They suffered from epidemic diseases. They faced constant warfare and violence. They were environmental degradation reducing the productivity of their lands. And they were developing social structures, slavery, patriarchy, hereditary inequality that caused immense suffering. No one had planned for any of this. The early farmers weren't trying to create inequality or warfare or environmental destruction. They were just trying to survive, to feed their families, to get through each season. But the logic of agriculture, the dynamics it set in motion, led inevitably to all these consequences. Each generation made small decisions that seemed reasonable in the moment, but that collectively transformed human society in ways no one would have chosen if they could see the full trajectory. And the most remarkable thing, none of this made people want to abandon agriculture. Despite all the costs, despite the clear evidence that life was worse in almost every measurable way than it had been for hunter-gatherers, agricultural societies continued expanding, growing larger, becoming more complex, moving toward the cities and states and empires that would define the next stage of human history. The trap had closed completely. There was no going back, and the only option was to continue forward, adapting, innovating, finding ways to survive in the world agriculture had created. So despite everything, despite the shorter stature, and the disease, and the violence, and the inequality, and the environmental damage, agriculture kept spreading. Not because it was better, we've established it wasn't, but because by around 6,000 years ago, something fundamental had shifted. Agriculture had become irreversible. The point of no return had been passed. Even if people wanted to go back to hunting and gathering, even if they recognized it had been better, they couldn't. Let me show you why. Start with the most basic reason. Mathematics. Pure, simple, inescapable mathematics. You're living in southern Mesopotamia 5,500 years ago. Your region, the alluvial plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, has maybe 200,000 people. 200,000. That's a conservative estimate. Some archaeologists think it was higher. These people are living in dozens of settlements, ranging from small farming villages to emerging cities of several thousand inhabitants. Now, how many people could this same region support as hunter-gatherers? The archaeological and ethnographic evidence gives us good estimates. In a rich environment like Mesopotamian river valleys before agriculture, you might support one person per square mile through hunting and gathering. Maybe two in particularly abundant areas. Let's be generous and say two. The inhabitable area of southern Mesopotamia is roughly 20,000 square miles, so at maximum you could support 40,000 hunter-gatherers, and that's if they were utilizing the entire area optimally, which is unlikely. Realistically, maybe 30,000 people, but you have 200,000, 5 to 7 times more people than hunting and gathering could possibly sustain. This isn't a matter of learning old skills or changing your lifestyle. This is simple carrying capacity. The land cannot support your population through hunting and gathering. It's physically impossible. Even if every person relearned every hunting and foraging technique perfectly, even if the wildlife populations magically rebounded to pre-agricultural levels, there's not enough to go around. Which means if you abandon agriculture, 150,000 people, maybe more, have to die. That's not a hypothetical. That's not an exaggeration. That's mathematics. The population is far beyond what non-agricultural subsistence can support, and no society chooses that. No community says, yes, let's abandon agriculture and watch 75% of our population starve to death. Even if life is hard, even if agriculture has created terrible problems, it's still keeping most people alive. The alternative is mass death on an unimaginable scale. So you continue farming. You have no choice. This is the ratchet effect. Agriculture allowed population growth. Population growth made agriculture necessary. Each generation had more people than the last. Each generation was more dependent on farming than their parents had been. The ratchet turned one direction only. Each click made going back harder until it became impossible. By 5,000 years ago, this pattern had spread across most of the Fertile Crescent, into Egypt, and was beginning in Europe and Central Asia. Everywhere agriculture was established for more than a few generations. Populations had grown beyond hunter-gatherer carrying capacity. The entire regional population was now locked into farming, regardless of whether it was optimal or even desirable. But the mathematical impossibility of returning is just one lock on the trap. There are others, equally powerful. Technology, for instance. Around 6,000 years ago, people in the Fertile Crescent and Anatolia discovered how to extract and work copper. Initially, they just hammered native copper, pure metal found naturally. But eventually they learned to smelt copper from ore, heating copper-bearing rocks in hot fires until the pure metal separated out. This was revolutionary. Copper tools were sharper and more durable than stone. Copper weapons were more deadly. Copper ornaments were beautiful and prestigious. Then, around 5,200 years ago, someone discovered that mixing copper with tin created bronze. Bronze is harder than copper, holds an edge better, is easier to cast into complex shapes. The Bronze Age had begun, and bronze tools and weapons transformed agriculture and warfare both. Bronze ploughs could break soil that stone tools struggled with. Bronze sickles harvested grain faster and more efficiently. Bronze axes cleared forests more quickly. Agricultural productivity increased. But here's the thing, bronze requires agriculture. Not just any agriculture, but surplus-producing agriculture, with enough extra food to support specialized craftspeople. Think about what's required to make a bronze tool. First, you need miners to extract copper ore and tin ore, often from different locations. These miners can't farm. They're working full-time in mines. Someone has to feed them. Second, you need smelters who know how to process the ore into metal. Specialized knowledge, full-time work. Someone feeds them too. Third, you need metal workers who can alloy copper and tin in the right proportions and cast or forge the metal into useful shapes. More specialists. More people who don't produce their own food. Then you need traders to move the metal and ore around, because copper and tin deposits aren't usually in the same place. Tin might come from hundreds of miles away. Those traders need to be fed, and you need administrators to organize all this, to keep track of resources, to coordinate production and distribution. A single bronze tool requires a network of specialists and an agricultural system productive enough to support them all. Hunter-gatherers can't make bronze. They don't have the food surplus to support non-food producing specialists. They don't have the sedentary population centers where specialized knowledge can be concentrated and passed down. Metalworking requires agriculture. And once you have metal tools, going back to stone is almost unthinkable. You're locked in technologically. Writing does the same thing. The earliest writing appeared in Mesopotamia around 5,400 years ago. Initially it was just accounting records, marks on clay tablets tracking grain stores, livestock counts, tax payments, not literature, just bureaucracy. But writing is incredibly powerful. It allows information to persist beyond human memory. It enables complex administration. It makes possible forms of organization that can't exist in oral cultures. But writing requires specialists too. Scribes who spend years learning the complex cuneiform system. Teachers to train them. Administrators who use written records to manage resources. All of these people need to be fed by agricultural surplus. Hunter-gatherers don't develop writing because they don't need it, and couldn't support scribes if they did. Once you have writing, though, it becomes essential. Tracking agricultural production across large areas, recording land ownership, documenting legal transactions, managing irrigation systems that serve multiple communities. All of this becomes vastly easier with writing. A society that develops writing gains massive organizational advantages over one that doesn't. And writing locks you into agriculture because agriculture is required to support the scribal class. The pattern repeats across every complex technology. Pottery wheels for mass-producing ceramics, looms for weaving textiles at scale, organized irrigation systems requiring hundreds of workers, monumental architecture like temples and palaces. Each technology requires specialization. Each specialization requires some people who don't produce food. And that requires agricultural surplus. By 5,000 years ago, societies across the Fertile Crescent had developed these technologies and were dependent on them. Abandoning agriculture meant abandoning bronze and writing and organized irrigation and all the other technologies that had become integral to life. It meant losing not just food production methods, but entire technological and organizational systems. Even if you could somehow support the population through hunting and gathering, which you couldn't, you'd be giving up capabilities that had become essential. And then there's the social lock-in. By 5,000 years ago, societies were becoming stratified in ways that made the powerful very invested in maintaining the system. Wealthy families controlled large amounts of agricultural land. They benefited enormously from the status quo. Why would they support returning to the egalitarianism of hunter-gatherer life, where their accumulated wealth would mean nothing? Leaders, chiefs, and early kings derived their power from controlling agricultural surplus and the people who produced it. They taxed farmers, redistributed food, organized large-scale labor projects, commanded warriors. Their entire power base depended on agriculture. They had every incentive to maintain and expand the agricultural system. Religious specialists, priests and priestesses had also emerged. They performed rituals for crop success, mediated between humans and gods, managed temples that often served as administrative centers. These religious institutions owned agricultural land, collected offerings of grain and livestock, employed large staffs. They were thoroughly integrated into agricultural society. All these powerful groups, the wealthy, the rulers, the religious authorities, benefited from agriculture and would resist any attempt to abandon it. They might compete with each other for power, they often did, but they all agreed on maintaining the agricultural foundation of society. The social hierarchy had become a mechanism for preserving agriculture, even when it was suboptimal for the majority. But perhaps the most important lock was psychological. By 5,000 years ago, multiple generations had lived entirely within agricultural society. The stories of hunting and gathering were ancient history, dim cultural memories of a distant past. Most people couldn't imagine living any other way. Agriculture, with all its problems, was just how life worked. You planted and harvested. You stored food for winter. You lived in permanent houses. You accepted social hierarchies. You participated in organized religion. This was reality. This was normal. The possibility of an alternative had faded from consciousness. Even if someone suggested returning to hunting and gathering, it would sound absurd, like suggesting people should live in the trees or give up fire. Agriculture had been naturalized, made to seem like the inevitable human condition, rather than a very recent and problematic innovation. And around 5,500 years ago, agriculture produced something that would make going back even more impossible. Cities. True cities. Not just large villages, but urban centres with populations in the tens of thousands. The first and most famous was Uruk in southern Mesopotamia. At its peak, around 5,100 years ago, Uruk had maybe 40,000 to 50,000 inhabitants. 40,000 people in one settlement. For comparison, the entire population of Great Britain at the time was probably less than 20,000. Uruk alone had more people than entire countries elsewhere. Walking through Uruk, you'd be overwhelmed by the scale and complexity. Massive city walls, more than 6 miles in circumference. The ziggurat, a stepped pyramid temple, rising more than 100 feet into the air. Densely packed mud brick houses lining narrow streets. Markets where craftspeople sold pottery, textiles, metal goods, jewellery. Administrative complexes where scribes recorded transactions on clay tablets. Canals bringing water from the Euphrates for drinking, sanitation and local irrigation. The city was a concentration of specialists unlike anything that had existed before. Potters who did nothing but make ceramics, weavers producing textiles, metalworkers crafting bronze tools and weapons, merchants trading goods from hundreds of miles away, priests managing temples and religious ceremonies, scribes maintaining records, administrators organizing labor and collecting taxes, warriors defending the city, and underlying all of it, farmers in the surrounding countryside producing enough surplus grain to feed 40,000 urban residents who weren't producing their own food. This level of specialization and organization required agriculture operating at high efficiency, and cities, once they existed, stabilized the agricultural system in new ways. Cities concentrated political and military power. The early kings of Uruk could mobilize thousands of workers for projects like digging irrigation canals or building defensive walls. They could command armies to defend agricultural lands or conquer new territories. This centralized power made the agricultural system more resilient to shocks. When local crop failures occurred, city administrators could redistribute grain from storage or organize imports from other regions. When external threats appeared, city-based military forces could respond in coordinated ways that dispersed villages couldn't. Cities provided services, like justice systems and organized defense, that made agricultural life more secure even if not more pleasant. And cities were impressive. People were proud of them. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the earliest literary works, written down around 4,600 years ago, has its hero praise the city walls of Uruk. Cities became focal points of identity and culture. People defined themselves as citizens of Uruk or Ur or Nippur. Urban civilization, despite its costs, generated loyalty and cultural attachment. Similar processes were happening in Egypt, where cities were emerging along the Nile around the same time. In the Indus Valley, where urban centres like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro would appear by 4,600 years ago. In northern China, where early cities were forming along the Yellow River. Independently, in different regions, agriculture was generating enough surplus to support urban populations, and those cities were reinforcing the agricultural systems that sustained them. By 4,000 years ago, the pattern was established across much of the Old World. Agricultural countryside supporting urban centres, cities organising and defending the agricultural system, trade networks connecting different regions, state-level political organisation managing resources across large territories. This is civilization in the technical sense. And civilization is entirely dependent on agriculture. You can't have cities without agricultural surplus. You can't have states without the ability to tax and redistribute food. You can't have writing and bronze and monumental architecture without agricultural productivity, supporting specialists. And civilization, once established, was self-perpetuating. Cities periodically collapsed, certainly. Uruk declined. Individual Mesopotamian cities fell to conquest or environmental degradation. But when one city collapsed, others rose. When northern Mesopotamian cities failed, southern ones continued. When all of Mesopotamia struggled, Egypt or the Indus Valley maintained urban centres. The system as a whole, agriculture supporting urban civilization, persisted even when individual components failed. This is crucial to understanding why agriculture never got abandoned even when the costs were apparent. Individual communities might fail, particular cities might be destroyed, specific agricultural systems might collapse from salinization or soil erosion. But the overall pattern of agricultural civilization was so widespread, so interconnected, so backed by powerful interests, that it continued regardless of local failures. And each generation was more committed than the last. Your great-great-grandparents, living 5,000 years ago, might have heard stories about pre-agricultural life. Your great-grandparents probably didn't. Your grandparents grew up entirely in agricultural society. By your generation, it's not even a question. Agriculture is reality. Cities are the centre of civilization. Writing and bronze and specialised crafts and organised religion and social hierarchies are how the world works. The population has grown to millions across the Fertile Crescent and beyond. The entire landscape has been transformed by thousands of years of farming. The wildlife populations that hunter-gatherers once relied on have been hunted to extinction or driven to remote areas. The forests have been cleared. The very ecology of the region has been fundamentally altered by agriculture. Even if someone somehow convinced everyone to abandon agriculture, even if the social and technological locks could be broken, the environmental changes are irreversible on human timescales. You can't just let everything return to wilderness and resume hunting and gathering. It would take centuries or millennia for ecosystems to recover enough to support hunter-gatherer populations, and the current population would starve long before that recovery happened. By 4,000 years ago, agriculture wasn't just the dominant subsistence strategy. It was the only possible one for the vast majority of humanity. The ratchet had turned so far that the mechanism was locked solid. Each of the lock's population, growth, technological dependence, social stratification, psychological normalization, urban civilization, environmental transformation, reinforced all the others. You couldn't remove one without addressing all of them, and removing all of them simultaneously was impossible. Agriculture had become not just a way of life but the foundation of human existence across vast regions, and it was still spreading. To Britain by 6,000 years ago, to Scandinavia by 5,000 years ago, across the steppes of Central Asia, into sub-Saharan Africa, to every corner of the Old World except the most extreme environments, and in the Americas, independent agricultural revolutions in Mesoamerica and South America were following similar trajectories. Each region that adopted agriculture went through the same process. Initial adoption, often gradual and partial. Population growth creating dependence. Development of inequality and violence. Emergence of specialization and technology. Ultimate lock-in where return became impossible. The pattern repeated because it emerged from the fundamental nature of agriculture itself, not from particular cultural choices or historical accidents. By 3,000 years ago, the transformation was essentially complete. The vast majority of humans lived in agricultural societies. Hunter-gatherer populations persisted only in areas unsuitable for farming. Deserts, Arctic regions, dense forests, areas too remote or marginal for agricultural expansion. And even these populations were increasingly marginalized, pushed into smaller territories as agricultural societies continued expanding. The gamble that had nearly failed 8,200 years ago had succeeded beyond any early farmer's imagination. Not because it made individuals healthier or happier, it didn't, but because it created systems that were self-reinforcing, that generated power and complexity and population growth that made the system irreversible. Agriculture had become humanity's permanent condition. The trap that had closed slowly over thousands of years was now sealed completely. And everyone alive, all the billions who would come after, would live with the consequences of a decision that a few thousand early farmers had stumbled into 9,000 years ago without understanding what they were creating. But here's the question that should haunt us gently as we drift towards sleep. What if agriculture had actually collapsed during the 8.2 kiloyear event? What if those 2 centuries of drought had been just slightly worse, the climate recovery just slightly slower, the survivors too few or too scattered to rebuild? What would human history look like? Would we even be here? The answer is yes. Humanity would have survived. We'd still be here. But everything else, cities, writing, bronze, civilization, all of it might never have existed. Because there was an alternative, a road not taken, and remarkably, some human societies saw that alternative, chose it consciously, and thrived for thousands of years. They watched agriculture develop nearby. They saw the trade-offs, and they said no. Let me tell you about them. Because their existence proves that the agricultural path wasn't inevitable. It was one choice among several, a choice that happened to succeed, barely, and that locked most of humanity into a particular trajectory. But not everyone made that choice. Some societies found other ways. Start in Japan. 14,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, people living on the Japanese islands developed something unprecedented: pottery. The earliest pottery anywhere in the world. They were creating elaborate ceramic vessels for storing and cooking food. Complex, sophisticated pottery that required specialized knowledge and significant labor to produce. This was the beginning of what archaeologists call the Jomon culture, named after the rope cord patterns they pressed into wet clay, and the Jomon culture would persist for more than 10,000 years. 10,000 years. That's longer than all of recorded history. Longer than the span from the first Egyptian pyramids to today. And through all that time, they never adopted agriculture. They knew about it. Agriculture was developing in nearby China. Rice cultivation, millet farming. The technology was right there, a few hundred miles away. Trade goods moved between Jomon communities and Chinese agricultural societies. They saw what agriculture could do, and they chose not to adopt it. Why? Because they didn't need it. The Japanese islands were rich in resources. Salmon runs in the rivers, abundant shellfish along the coasts, forests full of edible nuts, particularly chestnuts and walnuts, deer and wild boar for hunting. The Jomon people exploited all of these resources intensively but sustainably. They were sedentary, living in permanent villages. Some of these villages had several hundred residents and lasted for centuries. They built substantial houses, pit dwellings with thatched roofs. They created elaborate pottery, not just functional but artistic, decorated with complex designs. They made jewelry from shells and stone. They developed sophisticated fishing technology, hooks, nets, weirs. In some ways, they looked like early agricultural societies, permanent settlements, pottery production, complex material culture. But they weren't farmers. They were hunter-gatherers who'd found a way to live settled lives while maintaining the subsistence diversity that made hunting and gathering so resilient. Skeletal evidence from Jomon sites shows people who were healthy, well-nourished, relatively tall. None of the characteristic markers of agricultural populations. No epidemic disease signatures, no severe dental decay, no evidence of the nutritional stress that plagued early farmers. They were living settled lives, with all the cultural complexity that settlement enabled, without paying the health costs agriculture demanded. The Jomon culture finally declined around 2,300 years ago, when rice agriculture did eventually spread to Japan from Korea. And even then, Many Jomon populations resisted adoption, maintaining traditional subsistence patterns for centuries more in northern areas. They only abandoned hunting and gathering when agricultural populations expanded to the point where competition for resources became untenable. This proves something crucial. Sedentary life doesn't require agriculture. Pottery and permanent villages and cultural complexity don't require farming. The Jomon people had all of those things while remaining hunter-gatherers. Agriculture isn't the inevitable result of sedentism or population growth. It's one strategy among several, and not necessarily the best one. Halfway around the world, another group of people made a similar choice, but maintained it even longer. Aboriginal Australians reached Australia at least 65,000 years ago, possibly earlier. For the entire span from then until European contact in the 1700s, they never adopted agriculture. 65,000 years of successful hunting and gathering in an isolated continent, where they could have developed farming if they'd wanted to. And it's not that they lacked the knowledge or capability. Aboriginal Australians had sophisticated land management practices. They used fire systematically to manage landscapes, burning undergrowth to promote new growth that attracted game animals, creating mosaic patterns of different vegetation ages. This is sometimes called fire stick farming, and it's a form of environmental manipulation that's arguably more sophisticated than simple agriculture. They knew which plants were edible, which were poisonous, how to process toxic plants to make them safe. Some Aboriginal groups ground seeds and made them into cakes, essentially bread. They were one step away from cultivating those plants. They understood the principles. They chose not to. They domesticated exactly one animal. The dingo, a wild dog they brought with them or that arrived shortly after. The dingo helped with hunting, but also became a companion animal. But despite living alongside emus, kangaroos, and other large animals, they never domesticated them. They never created herds. They never became pastoralists, even though the option was there. Why not? Because hunting and gathering worked. Australia has challenging environments, certainly. Deserts, tropical rainforests, temperate zones, all requiring different strategies. But Aboriginal societies developed detailed ecological knowledge, allowing them to thrive in all these environments. They knew their territories intimately, knew where water could be found in dry seasons, where seasonal resources appeared, how to move across landscapes efficiently. They maintained population levels appropriate to their subsistence strategy, not through infanticide or violence, but through cultural practices that spaced births naturally. They remained mobile enough to exploit diverse resources. They organised into small bands that could split and combine flexibly, depending on resource availability. Everything about their social organisation was optimised for hunting and gathering success, and they were healthy. When Europeans first encountered Aboriginal Australians, they were impressed by their physical condition. Tall, athletic, with excellent eyesight and physical capabilities. One early European observer wrote that Aboriginal people could see things at distances Europeans needed telescopes to detect. Their health, their physical condition, their longevity were all comparable to or better than Europeans of the same period. Despite Europeans having centuries of agricultural civilization and increasingly sophisticated medical knowledge. Aboriginal Australians had complex spiritual beliefs, sophisticated art traditions including rock paintings tens of thousands of years old, oral histories preserving accurate information about landscapes and events from thousands of years past. They had culture, knowledge, social organisation, everything that supposedly requires civilization. They just didn't have agriculture, and didn't need it. Then there's the Pacific Northwest coast of North America. From northern California through Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, up to Alaska, indigenous peoples developed what anthropologists call complex hunter-gatherer societies. These were groups like the Haida, the Tlingit, the Kwakwaka'wakw, and dozens of others. And they created something that shouldn't be possible according to standard narratives about human social evolution. They had social hierarchies, chiefs, nobles, commoners, and in some groups, slaves, captured in warfare. They had hereditary status. They had inequality in wealth and power. They built large permanent settlements, some villages housing hundreds or thousands of people. They created elaborate art, totem poles, and carved housefronts and intricate masks. They had complex religious ceremonies, potlatches where leaders gave away enormous amounts of wealth to demonstrate status and power. All of this is supposed to require agriculture. The standard theory of social evolution says you can't have social stratification, hereditary inequality, large settlements, or monumental art without agricultural surplus. But the Pacific Northwest peoples had all of it without farming a single seed. How? Because they had abundant, reliable, storable resources. Salmon. 5 species of Pacific salmon run up the rivers of the northwest coast in massive numbers every year. So many fish that early European explorers said you could walk across rivers on their backs. Indigenous peoples built weirs and traps to catch salmon in enormous quantities. They smoked and dried the fish, creating stores that would last through winter. Add to that shellfish, available year-round along the coast. Marine mammals, seals and sea lions and whales. Terrestrial game, edible plants. The environment was so rich that people could remain sedentary, could support large populations, could accumulate surplus, all without needing agriculture. And they chose not to farm. Agriculture was expanding in other parts of North America. Corn, beans, and squash cultivation spread across much of the continent. The Northwest Coast peoples knew about it. They traded with agricultural groups. They saw what farming could provide, and they rejected it because what they had was better. The salmon runs were more reliable than crops. Fishing required less labour than farming. The stored dried fish provided security through winter without the vulnerability to crop failure that agriculture entailed. Marine resources gave them nutrition superior to grain-based diets. They looked at agriculture and accurately assessed that their traditional subsistence strategy was more efficient and more secure. These societies persisted until European contact, maintaining their complex social organisation and their non-agricultural subsistence for thousands of years. Only European diseases and colonisation disrupted them, not any inherent instability in their system. So here's what these examples tell us. Agriculture wasn't inevitable. Multiple societies had the knowledge, the capability, the opportunity to adopt farming. They consciously chose not to, and they thrived. The Jomon culture lasted 10,000 years. Aboriginal Australians lasted 65,000 years. Pacific Northwest cultures lasted thousands of years, all of them achieving cultural complexity, social organisation, artistic expression, and material success without agriculture. This means the agricultural revolution wasn't humanity discovering a better way to live. It was some human populations, mostly in the Fertile Crescent initially, getting trapped in a subsistence strategy that worked poorly, but that became impossible to escape once population growth occurred. Other populations, in different environments or with different choices, avoided the trap entirely, and this raises the tantalising possibility. What if the 8.2 kiloyear event had been just slightly worse? What if the drought had lasted 3 centuries instead of 2? What if the survivors had been too scattered to rebuild agricultural systems? What if agriculture had died out in the Fertile Crescent before it became irreversible? Humanity would have continued. The hunter-gatherer populations that never adopted agriculture would have been unaffected. Some mixed populations might have returned to full-time hunting and gathering, and with enough time for population to decline naturally, that would have become viable again. Knowledge of plant and animal domestication might have persisted in stories, the way knowledge of pre-agricultural life persisted in early farming societies, but cities would never have emerged. States and empires would never have formed. Writing might never have been invented, or if it was, it would be very different. Not accounting systems for tracking grain surplus, but something else entirely. Bronze and iron metallurgy might never develop because they require agricultural surplus to support specialised craftspeople. In this alternative timeline, human populations would be much smaller, maybe 10 million people globally instead of the billions we reached. But those people would be taller, healthier, living more egalitarian social structures. They'd have rich oral traditions, sophisticated ecological knowledge, complex spiritual beliefs. They'd have art and music and storytelling, but no written history, no monumental architecture, no technological trajectory leading to modern civilization. Some people romanticize this alternative. They imagine it as a paradise lost, humanity living in harmony with nature, free from the suffering agriculture created, and there's truth in that. Life expectancy would be good for those surviving childhood. Health would be excellent. Social equality would be the norm. No slavery, no serfdom, no hereditary aristocracy. But there would also be no modern medicine. No ability to prevent the childhood diseases that killed 30 to 40% of children. no understanding of germ theory or ability to perform surgery or treat infections, no protection against natural disasters beyond moving away from them, no accumulated scientific knowledge about how the universe works, and most problematically, no capacity to support large populations. If agriculture had failed 9,000 years ago and never redeveloped, global human population might still be under 10 million. That's 10 million healthy, autonomous individuals living rich cultural lives. But it's not 8 billion. The vast majority of humans who ever lived, including everyone listening to this, would never have existed. This is the fundamental trade-off. Agriculture made most individuals worse off, shorter, sicker, working harder, living under oppression. But it allowed far more individuals to exist. It's a numbers game where quality was sacrificed for quantity. And once the trade-off was made, once population grew beyond hunter-gatherer carrying capacity, there was no going back. The societies that rejected agriculture were making the opposite choice: quality over quantity. Maintain health and autonomy and equality even if it means population remains limited. Neither choice is obviously correct. Both have profound moral implications. If we value individual well-being, the hunter-gatherer path looks better. Each person lives a fuller, healthier, freer life. If we value the total number of humans who get to exist, agriculture wins despite its costs. More people experiencing life, even if each individual life is harder, might be preferable to fewer people experiencing easier lives. And there's another consideration. The technological and scientific progress that agriculture enabled eventually has value. It took thousands of years, but agricultural surplus eventually supported not just scribes and metalworkers, but also philosophers and mathematicians and scientists. The accumulated knowledge we have now about physics, biology, medicine, astronomy, all of that required the specialization that agriculture made possible. If agriculture had collapsed 9,000 years ago, we wouldn't have that knowledge. We wouldn't understand evolution or genetics or the structure of atoms. We wouldn't have developed vaccines or antibiotics or surgery. We wouldn't have sent probes to other planets or split the atom or figured out the age of the universe. All of that required the technological trajectory that began with agricultural surplus supporting specialists. So was it worth it? That's not a question with an easy answer. The early farmers suffered. The first few thousand years of agriculture were brutal. Short lives, hard work, disease, violence, oppression. Millions of people lived worse lives than they would have as hunter-gatherers. But those difficult millennia eventually led to improvements. Better healthcare, longer lifespans, labour-saving technologies, political systems that sometimes reduce oppression and increase freedom. Modern humans in developed countries live longer than hunter-gatherers did. We're taller than early farmers, finally reaching the heights of our Paleolithic ancestors. We have material comforts and medical care and opportunities for learning and expression that weren't available in either hunter-gatherer or early agricultural societies. It took 10,000 years, but we've partially recovered from the cost agriculture imposed while keeping the benefits of large populations and technological sophistication. But that recovery isn't complete and isn't universal. Billions of people still live in poverty. Inequality persists, arguably worse than in most hunter-gatherer societies. We face environmental challenges, climate change, biodiversity loss, that stem directly from agricultural transformation of landscapes. We have epidemic diseases, obesity, mental health crises, all traceable to mismatches between our biology and agricultural civilization. And we can't go back. We're 8 billion people. The landscapes have been transformed, the knowledge is partly lost. Even if we wanted to return to hunting and gathering, we're locked into agriculture as thoroughly as our ancestors were 5,000 years ago. More so, actually, because the population is so much larger and the environmental changes so much more extensive. We're living with consequences of decisions made 9,000 years ago by people who had no idea what they were creating. They were just trying to survive, just trying to feed their families, just responding to immediate pressures, and those reasonable, local, short-term decisions accumulated into a transformation of human existence that can never be undone. The societies that rejected agriculture show us the path, not taken. They prove it was possible to live differently, to maintain health and equality and autonomy, to create culture and complexity without the costs agriculture demanded. They're a reminder that history isn't inevitable, that humans made choices, and that those choices had profound, irreversible consequences. But they also show us something else. The resilience of those societies depended on remaining small, mobile, diversified. The moment agricultural populations grew large enough to compete for resources, the hunter-gatherer societies were overwhelmed, not because agriculture was better, but because it supported more people, and more people meant more warriors, more territory claimed, more pressure on the hunter-gatherers to either adapt or retreat. In the end, the agricultural societies won not through superiority, but through numbers. And numbers, once they exist, perpetuate themselves. Agriculture creates population growth. Population growth requires agriculture. The system reinforces itself until it's the only system possible. And now, 9,000 years later, we're all living in the world that system created. For better and worse, in sickness and in health, until whatever comes next. So here we are, 9,000 years later. You had breakfast this morning? Maybe bread made from wheat that was domesticated in the Fertile Crescent? Maybe rice from plants first cultivated in China? Maybe coffee from Ethiopia, sugar from New Guinea, potatoes from Peru. Every bite of food you eat connects you to that ancient gamble, to those desperate farmers who survived the 8.2 kilo-year event and somehow kept going. We're still living with their decision. We're still taller than early farmers, but shorter than our Paleolithic ancestors. We're still dealing with diseases that emerged from living with domesticated animals. We're still working far more hours than hunter-gatherers did. We're still living in a world shaped by inequality and environmental transformation that agriculture created, and we're still vulnerable in exactly the same ways. Our food system still depends on a handful of crops. Wheat, rice, corn and soybeans provide most of humanity's calories. We're still dependent on favourable climate. We're still one bad drought, one crop disease, one disrupted growing season away from crisis. The vulnerabilities that nearly destroyed civilization 8,200 years ago haven't disappeared. We've just gotten better at managing them, mostly. But we're also the beneficiaries of that gamble. We exist because agriculture allowed billions of people to live who couldn't have existed otherwise. We have medicine and technology, and accumulated knowledge because agricultural surplus supported specialists for thousands of years. We've partially recovered from agriculture's costs while keeping its benefits. It took 10 millennia, but we're finally almost as tall and healthy as the hunter-gatherers we once were. Every person alive today is descended from someone who made it through the initial adoption of agriculture, through the 8.2 kilo-year event, through the violence and disease and environmental collapse that followed, through thousands of years of gradual improvement. Your ancestors survived the worst decision in human history and somehow made it work. That's your inheritance, resilience, adaptability, the stubborn refusal to give up even when everything suggests you should. So if you've enjoyed this journey back through time, maybe hit that like button and subscribe for more long-form history. And tell me in the comments what you had for breakfast today. I love knowing we're all connected by these ancient choices. Sweet dreams. May your sleep be peaceful, your rest deep, and your morning breakfast, whatever it is, a reminder that you're part of the longest-running experiment in human history. An experiment that should have failed 9,000 years ago but somehow, impossibly, beautifully, continues still.